The death of Pius V was followed by one of the calmest papal interregnums of the age. There was no prolonged struggle, no public display of division, and no sign of the kind of turmoil that often accompanied the empty throne of St. Peter. On the very next day, the College of Cardinals reaffirmed the rules governing the election, binding itself to observe the established decrees on papal conclaves. Important offices were assigned at once to secure both the Vatican and the city. Girolamo Bonelli received responsibility for guarding the conclave, while Donato Stampa, Bishop of Nepi and Sutri, was given charge of the Borgo. Monte de Valentibus remained governor of Rome itself. Alongside these practical arrangements, urgent attention was also given to matters beyond the walls of the city, especially the continuation of the war and the Catholic alliance against the Ottoman Turks. Once the funeral ceremonies for the dead pope had been completed, the cardinals moved quickly toward the election. On May 12, 1572, Cardinal Farnese celebrated the Mass of the Holy Spirit, the solemn liturgy that traditionally marked the beginning of the conclave. Afterward, 51 cardinals entered the Vatican to begin the vote. Their number reflected the international character of the Sacred College, though the Italians still formed the clear majority. Before the doors were closed, Antonio Boccapaggiuli addressed the electors and urged them to seek a pope in the image of Pius V, a man firm enough in character and capable enough in judgment to guide the Church through a dangerous age. Later that same evening, Cardinal Granvelle arrived from Naples. His appearance was watched closely because he had long been expected by the Spanish ambassador as the man chosen by Philip II to direct the Spanish interest inside the conclave. Yet what followed surprised almost everyone. On the very next day, a new pope was chosen. The speed of the election astonished Rome and the wider diplomatic world alike, because many observers had expected a longer and more contested conclave. There was no shortage of powerful candidates. Several men of great standing were spoken of seriously, and among them, none pursued the papacy with greater energy or political skill than Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. He was one of the most brilliant and experienced members of the college, and his ambition for the tiara was well known. But his path was blocked by strong resistance. The Medici circle worked against him, and the opposition that gathered around them became even more effective because it found support from the Spanish crown. The weight of Spanish influence in the conclave now became unmistakable. Philip II had instructed Granvelle to reach Rome without delay and stop Farnese from advancing further. As soon as Granvelle entered the conclave, he went directly to Farnese and informed him in plain terms that the king, for the sake of preserving peace in Italy, expected him to abandon his hopes. Farnese was deeply shaken by the message. For a moment he was caught off guard, but he understood at once that resistance would be useless. Rather than waste his influence in a hopeless contest, he decided to redirect it. If he could not become Pope himself, he would help determine who would. He therefore turned to Bonelli, who led the group of cardinals closely tied to the late Pius V. Farnese suggested 4 names: Ricci, Savelli, Correggio, and Boncompagni. Bonelli was willing to consider only Boncompagni. The others raised objections or lacked broad enough support. But Boncompagni had a reputation that could bring different camps together. He was widely respected, known for moderation, and seen as a man of peace. Bonelli then offered several names of his own, including Rebiba, Soleto, Albani, and Paolo Burali. Most of these met resistance from Farnese. In the end, the discussion narrowed to Burali and Boncompagni. At the same time, another important faction was holding its own consultations. The cardinals associated with Pius IV weighed their options carefully. Charles Borromeo at first strongly supported Burali, a former Theatine whose moral seriousness and strict personal discipline were beyond question. But Burali's severity made other electors uneasy. men who feared a rigid and ascetic pontificate hesitated to support someone whose reputation for austerity was so pronounced. Borromeo then considered Sileto a scholar of high principle and respected learning, but Sileto was widely thought to lack practical experience in public affairs. Despite Borromeo's efforts, neither Burali nor Sileto could gather the necessary force behind his candidacy. That left Boncompagni as the only acceptable figure around whom agreement could form. The final obstacles were then removed. Some cardinals had pointed out that Boncompagni had not always been in harmony with Pius V, and Bonelli in particular raised this concern. But other influential men worked to quiet these doubts and smooth the path forward. Once that was done, the election moved with remarkable speed. By early evening the decision had been made, and Boncompagni had received the votes needed to become pope. When he himself cast his ballot for Granvelle during the scrutiny, he did so with a tact that made clear how well he understood the forces that had elevated him. In taking the name Gregory XIII, he chose to recall the feast of Gregory the Great, the day on which he had once received the cardinal's purple. His motto asked God to strengthen what had already been begun. Rome received the news with relief. Many had feared that the conclave might choose either a member of a religious order or a severe reformer in the style of the Theatines. Instead, the new pope appeared mild, approachable, and generous in temperament. His very surname invited wordplay, and many in the city were quick to say that a man named Boncompagni must surely prove a good companion. Ambassadors also looked on the election with cautious optimism. Gregory XIII had spent long years in the machinery of the Curia, moving through office after office and gaining an exact knowledge of law, administration, and procedure. He was not a figure raised suddenly by faction or accident. He was a career churchman formed by work, discipline, and experience. His background was far from princely. He came from a Bolognese family of respectable but not ancient greatness, a household that had risen through commerce rather than high lineage. His father, Cristoforo Boncompagni, was a merchant who, through skill and prudence, brought his family into a measure of prosperity. He was known for piety and generosity, especially toward the poor, and though he built a splendid palace near the Cathedral of Bologna, its grandeur stretched beyond what his fortune comfortably allowed. Through marriage into the Marescalchi family, the Boncompagni house gained entry into the aristocratic circles of the city. Among Cristoforo's sons, Ugo, born in 1502, showed early promise and devoted himself to the study of law at the University of Bologna. There, he built a serious academic reputation. He completed the required degrees and became a lecturer in law, teaching with distinction over several years. His students included men who would later rise to great prominence in the church, among them future cardinals and leading ecclesiastical figures. Yet his academic career did not continue indefinitely. His voice was not especially strong, and this practical limitation helped bring his teaching years to an end. In 1539 he left Bologna and went to Rome, entering the service of Cardinal Parisio, a connection that would open important doors for him. In the Roman Curia, his talent was quickly recognized. Under Paul III he received several early appointments, including legal and administrative posts, that placed him close to the workings of papal government. His career continued to advance. He established himself in Rome, built useful relationships, and in time received a more significant role connected with the Council of Trent. In 1548 he was among those sent to inform the Pope of the Council's transfer to Bologna. At first, his service to the future Julius III seemed likely to bring him even greater favour, but events did not unfold that way. After the election of Julius III, Boncompagni fell into papal disfavour. He was removed from one of his offices, and the coldness shown toward him became so clear that he thought seriously of leaving Rome altogether. Friends persuaded him to remain, yet for a time he withdrew from the centre of curial life and gave himself over to study. Only toward the end of that pontificate did he return to public office, when he was appointed vice-legate in the Campania. Under Paul IV, his fortunes changed once more. Though the stern character of that pope might seem far removed from Boncompagni's own manner, the new regime valued his skill as a jurist. He was called into reform work and later entered diplomatic service, accompanying Cardinal Carlo Carafa on important missions, first to France and then to Brussels at the court of Philip II. He also served on commissions dealing with difficult political and legal disputes, and was eventually raised to the bishopric of Viesti in southern Italy. Even after becoming bishop, he remained in Rome by papal permission, where his administrative usefulness kept him near the centre of government. He held office as vice-regent and later sat on a newly established Council of State. By the end of Paul IV's reign, it already seemed possible that the red hat might soon be his. That expectation was endangered by the fall of the Carafa family, with whom Boncompagni had worked closely. In moments like these, proximity to disgraced power could destroy a career. Yet he emerged without serious damage. He had even helped one of the condemned Carafas from his own limited means, but his personal reputation remained intact. Under Pius IV, he gained the confidence of both the Pope and Charles Borromeo and was appointed to the Consulta. This period proved decisive for his character. Though personally religious by nature, he had been formed in part by the worldly atmosphere of a curia still touched by the fading culture of the Renaissance. His close association with Borromeo, whose holiness and discipline were unmistakable, deepened and steadied the more serious side of his nature at a mature stage of life. That same seriousness became even more visible during the final period of the Council of Trent. Boncompagni went there in late 1561 as a close associate of the papal legate Simonetta. At first, he supported himself largely at his own expense, since his bishopric had been so damaged by Turkish attacks that it produced almost no income. In Trent, he placed his legal knowledge and disciplined intelligence fully at the service of the council. He advised on difficult questions, helped draft decrees, and earned praise from leading figures for the quality and reliability of his work. His role in debates over episcopal residence especially strengthened his standing. He had the patience, skill, and steadiness required for the most complicated matters of church law. His way of life during these years left a deep impression on those who knew him. He lived simply outside Trent and often walked long and difficult roads rather than choosing comfort. He rose at sunrise, recited the breviary in the open air, heard Mass, and then set out for the day's work. During those long walks, he reflected on council business and later discussed the same subjects in the evening, with bishops staying nearby. Even on the longest and most exhausting days, he was known for notable self-control. He did not interrupt his labour for refreshment and maintained an unusual calm even during moments of tension. When illness struck Pius IV, Boncompagni was remembered as one of the few who remained composed. By the time the council ended, the strain of his service had visibly marked him, and those who saw him on the road, back through Bologna, could tell how much the years in Trent had cost him. His reward came in 1565, when he was created cardinal on the feast of Gregory the Great. Those who knew the inside politics of Rome later said that his reserve had helped him greatly. His silence made him seem prudent, measured, and trustworthy, but silence alone did not explain his rise. He was also known for integrity, moderation, and a manner of life that inspired respect. Charles Borromeo's confidence in him mattered a great deal. Boncompagni avoided court intrigue, concentrated on legal work and public duty, and was praised by diplomats for his peaceable character and willingness to seek conciliation. When he was later sent to Spain on an important mission, he showed that this mildness was not weakness. At a farewell audience, when pressed with a hypothetical conflict between papal command and conscience, he answered frankly that he would not obey even the Pope in anything contrary to conscience or harmful to the Holy See. Under Pius V, he continued to work diligently, receiving another responsible office and devoting himself to its duties, with seriousness rather than display. He was not seen at festivals and sought little recreation beyond occasional visits to friends. He remained personally unambitious in material matters and even refused financial advantages unless they were properly approved. At the same time, he did not hesitate to oppose harsh measures when legal principle required it. This combination of restraint, honesty, and administrative mastery gave him a standing in Rome that was difficult to challenge. He had already been counted among the likely papal candidates in earlier conclaves. When he fell ill in the 1560s, people even remarked that such a man seemed destined not to die, except as Pope. By the final years before his election, his reputation was firmly established. Foreign ambassadors described him as one of the most capable members of the Sacred College, a man without serious enemies, deeply learned in canon law, courteous, though sparing in speech, and unusually well fitted to govern the Church. There remained one shadow from his earlier life, the existence of a son before he entered the priesthood. But even those who noted it also admitted that his later conduct had long been beyond reproach. By 1572, when the throne of St. Peter again stood vacant, Boncompagni was no longer merely a respected cardinal. He had become the kind of figure in whom experience, caution, reputation, and circumstance all met at exactly the right moment. That is why, when the conclave moved with sudden speed and the surprise of the watching world, the choice of Gregory XIII was not as accidental as it first appeared. It was the swift conclusion of a long career that had prepared him, step by step, for the highest office in the Church. From the very beginning of his pontificate, there were quiet concerns about the character of the new pope. Gregory XIII, known before his election as Ugo Boncompagni, possessed a naturally gentle and generous temperament. Some feared that this kindness might lead him, once in power, to soften the strict discipline that had defined the rule of his predecessor. His past also raised questions. He had spent much of his earlier life in a more worldly environment, and only later, under the influence of figures like Charles Borromeo, had he fully embraced a more austere vision of church life. It was whispered in Rome that such a man might not entirely forget the habits and impressions of his youth. These suspicions quickly gave rise to speculation. In certain circles, people began to say that the new pope would expand his household, increase spending, and ease the rigid controls imposed in previous years. Some even predicted that key figures of the reform movement would lose their influence. For those who preferred a more relaxed and comfortable atmosphere in the Curia, these rumours were encouraging. Many imagined that the new pontificate might resemble the more flexible and politically minded style of earlier times, rather than the disciplined and reform-driven leadership that had just ended. But these expectations were soon challenged. Gregory XIII made it clear, almost immediately, that he had no intention of abandoning the reforming path. His early decisions spoke louder than any declaration. He placed trusted and respected figures in key positions, men known for their integrity and their commitment to reform. Offices central to the administration of the Church were entrusted to individuals whose loyalty to strict discipline was beyond doubt. Even those whom many had expected to be dismissed remained in place, continuing their work without interruption. The turning point came when Gregory publicly confirmed his commitment to reform in his first formal gathering with the cardinals. There, he reaffirmed policies designed to protect church property and limit abuses that had long plagued the institution. He also made it clear that he would not favour his own family at the expense of the church. This declaration carried weight, especially in a period when nepotism had often shaped papal decisions. At the same time, he introduced stricter oversight in religious life, reinforcing enclosure for convents and assigning the reform of key institutions to some of the most disciplined and respected cardinals of the age. Observers quickly realized that Gregory XIII was following the example of his predecessor more closely than expected. Whether this was entirely his own inclination or partly the result of pressure from reform-minded advisors remained a matter of debate. Influential figures around him, including respected theologians and preachers, played a role in maintaining the momentum of reform. Yet among all these influences, one stood above the rest: Charles Borromeo. The relationship between Gregory XIII and Borromeo was both personal and decisive. It had been Borromeo who had supported Boncompagni earlier in his career and helped elevate him within the Church. More importantly, Borromeo had shaped his spiritual outlook during a crucial period of his life. The Pope held him in deep respect, almost reverence, and listened carefully to his advice. Even when Borromeo spoke with persistence or urgency, Gregory did not take offense. On the contrary, he valued such guidance, especially on matters concerning reform and discipline. Many of the early decisions of the new pontificate were influenced directly by Borromeo's counsel. This influence extended into the structure of the papal administration. Key appointments, including that of the Secretary of State, reflected Borromeo's recommendations. The man chosen for this role, Tolomeo Galli, was not of noble origin but had proven his ability through loyal and efficient service. Under Gregory XIII, he regained a position of great importance and stability, free from the interference of powerful relatives that had complicated the office in earlier times. The question of family influence, however, could not be avoided entirely. Like many popes before him, Gregory faced pressure to elevate his relatives. Under insistence from the cardinals, he granted the red hat to his nephew, Ugo Boncompagni. Yet this appointment did not translate into real political power. The young cardinal lacked both experience and authority, and his role was carefully limited. Key decisions remained firmly in the hands of the Pope and his trusted advisors. Financial support for him was modest, and for years he remained one of the least wealthy members of the Sacred College. A second relative, Filippo Guastaviani, was later elevated in similar fashion. This move was partly driven by tradition, as it was considered appropriate for a pope to have a close relative representing the dignity of the office in ceremonial matters. Yet here again, the practical influence of the new cardinal remained limited. Real authority continued to rest with experienced administrators like Galli. The most delicate situation involved Gregory's own son, Giacomo Boncompagni. Born before his father had entered the priesthood, Giacomo occupied a unique and sensitive position. The Pope clearly felt deep affection for him and granted him certain honours and responsibilities. He was given military commands and important titles, and his position at court was visible. Yet Gregory never allowed personal attachment to override his responsibilities. When Giacomo sought greater power, even aspiring to princely status or higher rank within the Church, the Pope refused to support these ambitions. At times, this restraint led to tension. Giacomo attempted various ways to secure a more stable future, even withdrawing from public life in hopes of gaining his father's sympathy. Eventually, Gregory arranged a prestigious marriage for him, strengthening his social and financial position. But when Giacomo overstepped his authority, acting without permission in matters of justice, the Pope responded firmly. He rebuked him and imposed restrictions, even sending him away from Rome for a time. These actions made it clear that no personal relationship would be allowed to interfere with the order of the Church. Compared to the relatives of other popes, Giacomo's resources remained limited. Observers were often surprised by how little he received. Gregory XIII deliberately avoided the appearance of favoritism, preferring to preserve the dignity and independence of the papal office, even when he later provided Giacomo with lands and titles outside the papal states. He ensured that these grants did not compromise the authority of the Church or its administration. This same principle extended to the Pope's broader family. Even his own brother was kept at a distance. Requests to visit Rome were denied, and financial support remained modest. Such decisions were not without personal cost, but they reflected Gregory's determination to place duty above private ties. Beyond these political and administrative choices, Gregory XIII's personal life revealed the same discipline and restraint. His daily routine was marked by structure, simplicity, and constant labour. He rose before dawn, devoted the first hours of the day to prayer, and then moved directly into his responsibilities. Audiences filled the morning, often so numerous that they had to be limited. Meals were brief and modest, taken without indulgence, and followed immediately by further work. The afternoon and evening continued in much the same rhythm. Meetings with officials, cardinals, and ambassadors were followed by private prayer and the review of documents. Even late into the night, he remained engaged in reading petitions and making decisions. His life was governed by a strict sense of time, which he regarded as one of the most valuable resources entrusted to him. Despite this demanding schedule, he maintained his strength through moderation and movement. He ate little, drank sparingly, and avoided excess in all forms. Whenever possible, he sought fresh air and physical activity, often walking long distances or spending time outside the crowded spaces of the Vatican. His retreats to villas in the countryside, especially the residence at Mondragone near Frascati, became an important part of his routine. There, surrounded by open landscapes and clear air, he continued his work while restoring his health. Even in these quieter settings, he remained accessible. Visitors travelled long distances to seek audiences, knowing that the Pope might be easier to approach away from the formalities of Rome. Important matters of state were discussed and significant decisions were made, all within an environment that combined work with renewal. In the city itself, Gregory maintained a visible presence. He attended religious ceremonies regularly, visited churches, and fulfilled his duties with consistency. Observers noted his dignity, his composure, and the quiet seriousness that marked his character. Even in old age, he retained remarkable energy, riding through the streets and participating fully in public life. Gregory XIII's concern for the poor and the suffering was constant, whether he was in Rome or spending time in the countryside. His generosity was not occasional or symbolic. It was deeply rooted in his character and expressed through steady, practical action. Even while living simply himself, he gave freely and often in secret, preferring that his acts of charity remain unnoticed. This instinct for helping others had been shaped early in life and only grew stronger with time. Long before he became Pope, he had already shown a strong commitment to aiding those in need. During his years connected with the Great Council in Trent, he had distinguished himself by his compassion and willingness to assist others. Once he assumed the highest office in the Church, this generosity expanded dramatically. His guiding principle was simple, yet powerful. Charity was not merely a virtue, but a duty that had to be lived out constantly. Those around him later remarked that few leaders in the Church's history had matched his dedication to the poor. His support extended across a wide range of people and causes. He gave assistance to widows, orphans, and young women who lacked the means to marry. Clergy, scholars, and those who had converted to the faith also found help through his efforts. Educational institutions and charitable organizations benefited from his support, especially those created to provide financial relief to the needy. His giving was not limited to one group or region. It reached anyone he believed to be suffering or in need of support. He did not rely solely on reports from others. Early in his pontificate, he personally visited major hospitals in Rome to understand the conditions of the sick and poor firsthand. Afterward, he ensured that regular inspections would continue so that care would not decline over time. When crises arose beyond Rome, he responded quickly. During an outbreak of plague in Avignon, he sent aid without hesitation, providing both material and spiritual assistance. He also encouraged others to follow the same path. When newly appointed bishops came to him, he consistently urged them to practice active charity in their own dioceses. He reminded them that compassion was not only a moral obligation, but something that would be rewarded, both in this life and beyond. His concern extended to those captured in conflict, especially Christians held in captivity. Large sums were spent to secure their freedom, and he maintained ongoing efforts to support such missions. Particular attention was given to communities facing hardship because of their faith. Refugees, exiles, and those displaced by conflict or persecution received assistance from him. He believed that shared faith created a shared responsibility, and that no one should be abandoned in times of suffering. His correspondence reflected this belief, emphasizing the importance of standing with others in their misfortune. The scale of his charitable work was immense. Over the years, vast sums were distributed for relief, support, and social welfare. These efforts were not limited to visible or public initiatives. Many contributions were made quietly, without record or recognition, driven by personal conviction, rather than the desire for praise. Despite this generosity, his personal habits remained disciplined and restrained. He avoided luxury and maintained a simple lifestyle, ensuring that his own needs did not overshadow his responsibilities to others. This balance between personal austerity and public generosity defined his approach to leadership. Those who observed him closely noted that his character combined kindness with firmness. He had a calm and measured temperament, rarely showing anger and maintaining composure even in difficult situations. His decisions were shaped by careful thought and a deep understanding of both people and circumstances. His experience within the Church's administration allowed him to assess situations quickly and respond effectively. At times, his reserved nature gave the impression of severity. He spoke little, preferred clarity over elaboration, and avoided unnecessary discussion. Requests that lacked merit were dismissed directly, while those that deserved approval were granted without delay. His style was efficient and focused, reflecting both his legal training and his sense of responsibility. Yet, this outward firmness did not mean rigidity. He was capable of reconsidering decisions and adapting when necessary. First impressions could influence him, but he was equally willing to revise his views after reflection. This flexibility allowed him to balance principle with practicality. He also maintained a strong sense of independence. He listened to advice, but did not allow himself to be controlled by others. Even those closest to him understood that final decisions rested with him alone. He believed that a leader must remain impartial and avoid forming close personal alliances that might compromise judgment. This independence was evident in his governance. He reviewed reports personally, questioned officials directly, and involved himself in both major and minor matters. While trusted advisors handled daily administration, he remained fully informed and actively engaged in decision-making. His attention to detail and ability to organize complex systems contributed to the effectiveness of his leadership. One of his lasting contributions was the development of more structured administrative bodies to handle the growing demands of the Church. Specialized groups were formed to address specific issues, allowing for more focused discussion and more efficient decisions. These groups worked closely with him, but ultimate authority remained in his hands. He also strengthened diplomatic connections, recognizing the importance of accurate information and effective communication. Representatives were placed in key regions, not only to manage relations with political authorities, but also to oversee religious matters and support reform efforts. Their role became increasingly active, reflecting the changing needs of the time. Through these measures, he ensured that the Church could respond more effectively to challenges both within and beyond its borders. His approach combined organization, discipline, and a broad understanding of global developments. At the start of 1573, a major effort was launched to revive religious life across the territories of the Church. 7 respected bishops were chosen as apostolic visitors and sent into different dioceses with a very clear mission. They were told to act with patience, gentleness, and charity so that the people would understand that Rome was not coming as an enemy, but as a guide. Before making judgments, they were expected to learn everything carefully. Petty matters were not to distract them. Their attention was to remain fixed on the larger problems that affected the life of the Church: the authority of bishops, the reputation and conduct of the clergy, the proper use of church penalties and money, and the defence of ecclesiastical rights, wherever secular rulers tried to weaken them. Detailed rules were prepared for their work among bishops, cathedral chapters, parish churches, women's convents, and religious confraternities. They were also instructed to warn lay people firmly when needed. Above all, the visitors were to determine whether the reforms ordered by the Council of Trent were actually being carried out, and wherever they were not, to correct the situation with prudence and firmness. The seriousness of this campaign can be seen in the care with which it was organized. In Bologna, for example, the bishop appointed for the visitation concentrated on the city itself and then assigned separate delegates for the plains and the mountain districts, so that no part of the diocese would be neglected. Before long, these visitations were extended beyond the central territories of the papacy and spread across the rest of Italy. The surviving records from these inspections show just how determined Gregory XIII was to turn Tridentine reform into a living reality. These reports are extraordinarily valuable because they reveal the real condition of dioceses in remarkable detail. They speak not only about doctrine and discipline, but also about local economies, parish life, public morality, the quality of the clergy, and the practical methods used to renew the Church. In the early years alone, dioceses and religious houses across central and northern Italy were drawn into this movement, and year after year the circle widened. A strong supporter of this method was Charles Borromeo. When he came to Rome near the end of 1574, he strongly encouraged the Pope to continue sending apostolic visitors. He believed that an outsider could often see abuses more clearly than the local bishop, and as a representative of the Pope, he could handle matters that were too sensitive or too difficult for a diocesan bishop to address alone without provoking resentment. Borromeo even offered his own help in the regions connected with Milan, and Gregory accepted. In 1575, a new group of bishops received appointments as visitors, and letters were sent to the secular rulers of northern and central Italy, asking them to assist the work. Borromeo himself took up the task with characteristic energy. While others began visitations in Milan, He devoted himself to neighbouring dioceses, examining local conditions with painstaking attention. His work was interrupted by plague, but once the worst had passed, he resumed his efforts with even greater determination. In the troubled lands around Brescia, where Protestant influence had made conditions especially difficult, he spent years investigating abuses, correcting disorders, and trying to restore Catholic life. His persistence gradually produced results. At the same time, many other apostolic visitors were at work across Italy. From Tuscany to Lombardy, from the Venetian mainland to the far south, bishops moved through dioceses, monasteries, and religious communities, inspecting, correcting, and rebuilding. Yet not everywhere welcomed them. Venice, in particular, became the scene of fierce resistance. Borromeo had long warned that reform was urgently needed there, but the Republic was deeply suspicious of papal interference. Gregory tried to avoid unnecessary conflict by choosing men acceptable to Venetian opinion, including Venetian bishops themselves. But opposition rose almost immediately. Venetian leaders insisted that no outsider had any right to enter their religious houses, claiming that their own patriarch was fully capable of carrying out whatever reform was necessary. Beneath this argument lay a deeper issue. The Republic wished to keep firm control over ecclesiastical institutions, especially where property, hospitals, and charitable foundations were concerned. It refused to provide information about revenues and resisted any inquiry that might weaken state supervision. The dispute became so bitter that the language used by Venetian officials turned openly hostile. Yet Gregory did not yield. The papal representative then in Venice had already weakened the papal position by making concessions, and he was replaced by a new nuncio who received strict orders. The question of visitation was one of the Pope's highest priorities. The new envoy proceeded carefully. He built relations with influential churchmen, avoided unnecessary provocations, and at first limited the scope of the visitation to clergy and male religious communities, leaving the most sensitive areas aside for the moment. This patient approach eventually produced a compromise. A Venetian bishop would conduct the visitation, and certain subjects that most alarmed the Republic would temporarily remain untouched. Once this arrangement was accepted, the process moved forward with far less resistance. In time, the results were so clearly beneficial that even many of those who had first opposed the whole undertaking were forced to admit its value. Gregory's concern for reform did not stop at Italy. He also tried to extend the benefits of visitation to Catholic lands beyond the Alps. Political realities blocked some of these efforts, especially in territories where larger powers controlled the situation. But in other regions, the work advanced. Trusted bishops were given wide authority, not only as papal envoys, but also as visitors, and similar reforms were pursued in Switzerland, Poland, and Spain. One experienced churchman, after years of labour in German-speaking lands, even composed a practical guide explaining how to gather accurate information on the true condition of dioceses. This reveals an important point. The reform movement was no longer improvised. It had become methodical, disciplined, and increasingly self-aware. The results were significant. The apostolic visitations ordered under Gregory XIII helped spread a more serious ecclesiastical spirit through the clergy. In many places, priests began to show greater devotion, stronger pastoral commitment, and a deeper sense of sacrifice. The Pope's achievement lay not only in issuing commands, but also in inspiring bishops to embrace the work wholeheartedly. Some of them wore themselves out in the process. One bishop was said to have died because he had exhausted his strength in carrying out visitations. Elsewhere, archbishops and coadjutor bishops personally undertook the task in their own dioceses. In Bologna, Cardinal Paleotto visited even the most remote mountain districts. In Naples and many other places, church leaders pushed reform with the same seriousness. A number of bishops also became known not only as reformers, but as fathers of the poor. Some stripped themselves of nearly all they possessed in order to relieve suffering. Others founded institutions for the sick who were ashamed to beg, ensuring that they could receive doctors, surgeons, and medicine without cost. The work of visitation was reinforced by provincial and diocesan synods, which helped secure and deepen the changes already begun. Among the churchmen who showed special zeal in this field, Charles Borromeo stood out above all. During the last 10 years of his life, his activity expanded until it reached far beyond Milan and affected the wider Catholic world. His role can hardly be overstated. The Council of Trent had drawn the great lines of reform, but it could not regulate every detail of church life. Borromeo became one of the men who translated those principles into practical rules. Through synods, instructions, visitations, schools, seminaries, and constant supervision, he turned theory into discipline and discipline into lived experience. In this sense, his work served as a living continuation of the council itself. No bishop of his age held so many synods. The Council of Trent had ordered that archbishops gather their suffragan bishops regularly in provincial synods, and that diocesan synods also be held. Borromeo followed this rule as closely as circumstances allowed. Over the years he convened repeated assemblies in Milan, and he also gathered diocesan synods, with striking regularity. The importance of these meetings was immense. Their decrees did not simply repeat the council. They took the broad principles of reform and developed them into precise, workable norms suited to everyday church life. For this reason, Borromeo came to be regarded as a teacher of bishops. Church leaders across Europe asked for copies of his decrees. They spread quickly from place to place, and many bishops used them as models for their own legislation. The collection, eventually known as the Acts of the Church of Milan, became one of the most influential ecclesiastical texts of the age. It dealt with almost every aspect of church life: feast days and fasting, indulgences and charitable foundations, preaching and the sacraments, church revenues and administration, ecclesiastical courts, episcopal offices, records, and statistics. In short, it offered a complete guide to the ordering of a diocese. Later, generations treated it with extraordinary respect. Bishops found in it a practical handbook for governance, and many later synods borrowed from it heavily. In some places, the very thoroughness of Borromeo's legislation was one reason local synods were held less often, because his norms already provided direction for nearly every problem that might arise. For Borromeo himself, however, synods were never mere legal exercises. He saw them as moments of spiritual renewal. Before they opened, prayer and sacramental preparation were urged upon the people. While they lasted, sermons were preached, public prayer was intensified, and clergy were drawn into spiritual exercises. Reform, in his mind, had to begin with conversion of heart. Borromeo's greatness did not lie in legislation alone. He also embodied the ideal bishop envisioned by the post-Tridentine Church. The Council had placed enormous responsibility on bishops for the restoration of Catholic life, and in Borromeo the Church saw a man who demonstrated how that responsibility could actually be fulfilled. What could appear dry or severe in written decrees became vivid and compelling in his example. He showed that reform was not a theory but a way of life. Yet the task before him was immense. The Archdiocese of Milan was enormous, stretching across political frontiers and including mountains, plains, cities, villages, monasteries, and frontier territories. It contained thousands of churches, hundreds of parishes, countless clergy, and a population that reached well into the hundreds of thousands. Added to this was the wider ecclesiastical province under Milan's influence, which covered a vast region of northern Italy. The problems were equally vast. Ignorance was widespread among clergy and laity alike. Some priests barely knew the words they needed for the sacraments. Some laypeople did not even know the basic prayers of Christianity. Churches were often treated with little reverence. In some places they were used for worldly purposes, and even religious houses could fall into disorder. Ecclesiastical courts and church discipline had weakened badly, especially in border regions. Yet Borromeo never lost confidence. He believed completely that the Church, because it was founded by Christ, possessed within itself the power for renewal. Prayer, hard work, sacrifice, and personal holiness formed the basis of all his action. This explains the severity of his own life, his careful choice of collaborators, and his unwavering concentration on the duties of his own office. He gave up other honours and responsibilities so that he could devote himself entirely to Milan and to the dioceses linked with it. Even when wider opportunities were offered to him, he refused anything that might distract him from the work entrusted to him. His methods were practical and far-reaching. He sought to awaken the clergy not only through punishment, but through instruction, encouragement, and constant supervision. He divided Milan and the countryside into districts, and placed trusted priests over each section. Through them, the Archbishop's intentions reached even the smallest parishes. Meetings were held regularly so that experiences could be shared and better methods discussed. Parish priests were brought together to examine difficult cases of conscience and improve their knowledge. In this way, reform became organised and continuous rather than occasional or improvised. He was especially determined to form a new generation of priests. Even before he was able to reside fully in Milan, he had already worked to establish a seminary in accordance with Tridentine principles. Once that foundation existed, he went further. He created additional institutions for different needs: seminaries for rural clergy, houses for older candidates who needed a shorter course of study, schools that focused on elementary grammar, training centres for youths from mountain regions whose upbringing required a different environment, and institutions meant to serve frontier areas near Switzerland. He also worked hard to create a college for Swiss students, so that both Italian-speaking and German-speaking Catholics from the region could be trained as strong and faithful priests. Not every plan succeeded, but enough did to show the scale of his vision. His concern for education extended well beyond the clergy. In Milan, there already existed Sunday schools devoted to Christian instruction for children and uneducated adults, and Borromeo supported them with great energy. These schools taught the basic truths of the faith, but they also helped children learn to read, since elementary literacy and catechetical instruction were often closely connected. Borromeo considered them one of the most fruitful institutions in his whole diocese. Alongside these efforts, he founded colleges for students and nobles, promoted higher learning, supported the Jesuits and Theatines, built houses for religious communities, and established institutions for the poor, vulnerable women, and those in danger of falling into misery. He also organised a community of secular priests dedicated to service under disciplined spiritual rules, and helped guide the reform of other religious groups. Even these achievements do not fully measure the extent of his labour. His correspondence alone reveals the astonishing range of his influence. Letters reached him from every level of society and from across Europe. Rulers, bishops, priests, religious, scholars, local pastors, and ordinary people all turned to him. Messages came from cities and villages, from the Alps and the plains, from the great courts of Europe, and from distant Catholic outposts. This flood of communication was not ignored or left to others. It was directed under his personal supervision. Anyone who looks at the scale of this work is forced to wonder how one man could carry it. The answer lies partly in the extraordinary discipline of his life. He slept little, worked constantly, and subjected himself to such rigorous habits that those around him felt he had gained an almost complete mastery over his body and his time. The fruits of his work in Milan were remarkable. Many priests who had once lived in ignorance or confusion came to understand their calling more clearly through his example and instruction. Structures were put in place to keep that renewal alive. At the same time, the wider atmosphere of the age helped him. The Council of Trent had already marked the beginning of a new era. Under strong popes and in the presence of reforming bishops, many people felt that the time had come to break decisively with old failures and live in a new way. Even during his own lifetime, Borromeo was widely regarded as a holy man. Crowds sought to see him, and many already treated him as a saint before the Church officially did so later. His example also mattered for another reason. Bishops, after the Council of Trent, increasingly had to deal with the growing power of the modern state. Secular governments were beginning to draw more and more authority into their own hands, including rights that earlier generations had regarded as belonging naturally to the family or to the Church. For bishops, this created a constant tension. They wished to live peacefully, with lawful rulers, but they also had to defend the freedom of the Church without making her position worse through needless conflict. In this struggle, Borromeo became a lasting model. He fought for ecclesiastical rights with exceptional courage, and he did so under conditions in which even some of his friends thought the battle was already lost. That was one of his greatest achievements. Not only that he reformed his diocese, but that he showed how a bishop could stand firm, remain faithful, and still reshape the religious life of an entire age. During the later years of the 16th century, tensions between ecclesiastical authority and secular power in Milan reached a dramatic peak. A striking example of this conflict unfolded under the rule of a Spanish governor whose actions increasingly clashed with the authority of the archbishop. The situation escalated when the governor asserted control over Arona, a town closely tied to the archbishop's family. He went further by surrounding the archbishop's residence with armed forces and intercepting private correspondence. These actions were seen as a direct violation of ecclesiastical independence. In response, the archbishop took a bold and unprecedented step. He publicly excommunicated the governor. The consequences were immediate and powerful. The social fabric of Milan shifted almost overnight. Members of the nobility refused to accompany the governor in public. Ordinary citizens withheld customary signs of respect. Foreign diplomats distanced themselves from him entirely. The act of excommunication did not remain a symbolic gesture. It reshaped the political and social reality of the city. The crisis resolved itself only when the governor received a new appointment abroad and departed from Milan. His exit brought temporary relief, but the underlying tensions had already deepened. His successor proved even more confrontational. From the very beginning, relations deteriorated rapidly. The new governor openly challenged the authority of the archbishop, treating him with visible disrespect and making it clear that royal interests would take precedence over church regulations. He actively worked to undermine the reforms being introduced, attempting to discredit the archbishop both locally and in distant courts. One of the most revealing clashes occurred over the observance of Lent. When the archbishop sought to restore traditional practices, the governor deliberately organized public festivities that contradicted the spirit of the season. Even when participation in these events was discouraged under threat of spiritual penalties, the governor continued to promote them, creating an atmosphere of defiance. Efforts were also made to turn public opinion against the archbishop. Workers were summoned and pressured to oppose his authority. Reports critical of his actions were sent to influential centres of power. Eventually, officials in Milan were compelled to send representatives to Rome to lodge formal complaints. Many of the accusations, however, were rooted in resistance to moral discipline. The archbishop was criticised for restricting public dances that often led to violence, for limiting entertainment during religious periods, and for preventing the misuse of sacred spaces. These measures, though intended to restore order and reverence, were portrayed as excessive interference. As the campaign against him intensified, even powerful rulers began to express frustration. There were suggestions that he should be removed from his position altogether. Defending himself, the archbishop emphasized that his actions were not arbitrary, but grounded in long-standing traditions and principles of the Church. Despite this, doubts began to emerge, even among supporters of reform. Some questioned whether his strict approach was practical in a changing political environment. Others feared that his actions might provoke unnecessary conflict with powerful authorities. Criticism grew more visible when voices within the Church itself began to express reservations. Public sermons hinted at disagreement with his policies. In Rome, constant complaints gradually shaped a more cautious attitude toward his work. His initiatives, once admired, now faced increasing scrutiny. At the same time, resistance within his own diocese intensified. Both clergy and lay people began to challenge his authority more openly. Some used perceived hesitation from Rome as justification for ignoring his directives. Social disorder began to reappear, undoing years of reform. Reports described a surge in violence and moral decline, highlighting how fragile the progress had been. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, it became clear that only direct intervention could resolve the crisis. The archbishop decided to travel to Rome and present his case in person. What followed surprised many. Instead of facing rejection, he was received with overwhelming respect. Crowds gathered to welcome him even before he entered the city. Influential figures who had previously distanced themselves now sought his presence. The Pope himself extended a warm reception and invited him into close discussion. In Rome, the archbishop defended his actions with clarity and conviction. His policies were reviewed, debated, and ultimately reaffirmed. Measures that had been heavily criticized were reinstated with official support. His Reform Council received approval, strengthening his authority against future opposition. The outcome marked a decisive turning point. The narrative that he had lost support collapsed completely. Even attempts by his opponents to renew accusations failed to gain traction. Upon his return to Milan, the reality became unmistakable. The population welcomed him with genuine enthusiasm, contradicting claims that he had been widely disliked. When reforms were reintroduced, many embraced them willingly, demonstrating that earlier resistance had not reflected the true spirit of the people. Yet opposition did not disappear entirely. The governor continued to provoke tensions, organizing events that disrupted religious life. Still, his actions now appeared increasingly isolated. Support from Rome became more explicit. Official declarations confirmed the legitimacy of the archbishop's work and encouraged him to continue defending ecclesiastical authority. Shortly afterward, the death of the governor removed a major source of conflict. Seeking lasting stability, the archbishop ensured that his position was clearly understood at the highest political level. Through careful diplomacy, he secured a more favourable relationship with the ruling powers. Subsequent governors adopted a more cooperative approach, allowing both civil and religious authorities to function in harmony. Amid these struggles, another defining moment emerged. a devastating outbreak of plague. During this crisis, the archbishop's character became freely visible. He devoted himself entirely to the care of the sick, risking his own life to provide aid and comfort. His actions left a lasting impression, demonstrating that his leadership extended far beyond discipline and governance. With renewed stability, he turned his attention to regions threatened by religious confusion and moral disorder. In remote areas, he confronted ignorance, superstition, and the spread of opposing beliefs. His efforts aimed to strengthen faith and prevent further division. Even as his health declined, he continued his work with unwavering determination. A growing awareness of his approaching end led him to focus more deeply on spiritual reflection. Retreating for periods of intense prayer, he prepared himself quietly, while still fulfilling his responsibilities. In the final weeks of his life, illness overtook him. Despite this, he continued to carry out his duties for as long as possible. Eventually, his strength failed, and he passed away peacefully. The reaction to his death was profound. His absence was felt not only as the loss of a leader, but as the disappearance of a guiding light. His legacy endured through the structures he built, the reforms he established, and the example he set. Gregory XIII showed remarkable generosity toward the Theatines, and his support for them can be traced through the many privileges and favours he extended to their houses in places such as Rimini, Milan, Cremona, Padua, Genoa, Naples, and Capua. In Rome, he also contributed a large sum to help complete their church of San Silvestro al Quirinale. Not long before his death, he also lived to see the beginning of a Theatine house at Mantua. His care for religious institutions was not limited to them alone. In 1582, he entrusted the ancient church on the Tiber island, dedicated to St. John Calabita, to the Brothers of Mercy, better known as the Fate Bene Fratelli. Their nearby hospital already enjoyed a strong reputation, and the Pope strengthened it further with a major financial gift. His attention also reached newer clerical communities that were being formed to answer the pastoral needs of the age. In Milan, Charles Borromeo had founded the Oblates of St. Ambrose, a body of secular priests who gave themselves to their bishop for spiritual labour. Gregory XIII also approved the Clerks Regular of the Mother of God, established at Lucca by Giovanni Leonardi for a similar purpose. Yet Gregory's role in religious life was not simply that of a patron who gave money and recognition. He also acted as an organizer and judge whenever older orders fell into disorder or newer movements needed structure. He was deeply concerned with discipline, reform, and the prevention of conflict inside the religious world. This became especially clear in the Franciscan family. Among the observant Franciscans there had emerged a stricter current, known as the Alcantarines. They lived with greater austerity than many of the other observants, yet all remained under the same superior. Such a situation inevitably led to tension. Rival habits of life produced rivalry of spirit, and disputes became constant. Gregory ordered that both sides present their case before the congregation responsible for bishops and regulars. After hearing the matter, he decided in favour of the stricter reformers, speaking of them with great approval and forbidding others to obstruct them or transfer them into less severe houses. At the same time, he did not allow the group to become fully independent. They were to remain a distinct branch within the larger Franciscan structure and continue under the common general. In a similar way, Gregory supplemented earlier legislation concerning reformed Franciscan houses and tried to give clearer shape to their legal standing. His sympathy for reform was perhaps even stronger when it came to the Capuchins. During his pontificate, they were spreading rapidly through Italy and had become known for the energy of their preaching, their popular missions, and their closeness to ordinary people. Gregory XIII held them in unmistakably high esteem. Numerous documents issued during his reign granted them privileges, protections, and material help. Their work among the people impressed him deeply, and nothing seems to have shaken his affection for them. When critics among the cardinals pointed out weaknesses and failings within the order, Gregory answered with a striking image. "The greater and nobler an order is," he said in substance, "the more exposed it will be to danger. The sea itself throws back whatever does not belong to it." In that brief reply, he showed both realism and confidence. He did not deny that problems existed, but he refused to judge the whole body by its worst elements. One of his most important decisions came in 1574, when he revoked the older restriction that had confined the Capuchins to Italy. By doing so, he opened the way for their expansion beyond the peninsula, and gave firm legal support to foundations already attempted in France, especially at Meudon and Paris. Influential churchmen and rulers had encouraged this development, and Charles Borromeo also helped the cause by writing in support of the Capuchins to sovereigns and papal representatives. Soon, the order moved into further regions. A convent at Barcelona marked their entrance into Spain, and at Gregory's express desire, they later entered Switzerland as well. Their arrival in Switzerland was especially significant. Just as in Italy, these friars became known as genuine men of the people. Their constitutions had by then been settled and printed, giving their life a stable form. In the valleys and mountain districts of Switzerland, they gradually established themselves through hardship, humility, and service. They worked not only as preachers and confessors, but also as comforters of the sick and helpers of the poor. Their first house at Altdorf was followed by others in Lucerne, Stans, Schwyz, Appenzell, Soleure, Baden, Frauenfeld, and Zug. Their success rested less on wealth or influence than on sacrifice, mobility, and their capacity to reach forgotten populations. At the same time, Gregory's period also saw renewed life in the Basilian tradition, the monastic form associated with Eastern Christians in communion with Rome. In the East, many Basilian monasteries had suffered under difficult conditions and some had disappeared. Yet in Spain, a monastery dedicated to Saint Mary of Oviedo had adopted the rule of Saint Basil and had already been linked with the Italian Basilians. When a fixed monastic rule was later required for all monks, 2 more Spanish houses chose the Basilian rule as well. Gregory XIII gathered these monasteries into a Spanish province, but kept them under the authority of the Basilian superior in Italy. The election of this superior was later confirmed by the Pope, and at the same time the constitutions of the Basilians were reorganized. For Greek monastic tradition, this kind of union into a single congregation was something relatively unfamiliar, and it represented a new attempt to give unity and discipline to scattered communities. Gregory also promoted the reform of religious life outside Italy through his nuncios. In Germany and Poland, he supported efforts to restore discipline and order, while in Bohemia, the decayed state of monasteries led to a visitation arranged with imperial backing. In Dalmatia, a hermit order dedicated to St. Paul, the first hermit, became the object of zealous reform. These scattered actions reveal a consistent pattern. Gregory XIII did not view monastic reform as a local or secondary matter. He regarded it as essential to the life of the Church, and he used papal diplomacy, visitation, and legal decrees to push it forward in different lands. Spain presented one of the most difficult fields. Earlier efforts at reform there had already been vigorous, but under Gregory XIII, the papal nuncio Niccolo Ormanetto resumed the work with determination. His intervention stirred resistance almost immediately. Complaints poured into Rome, and delegations came to denounce his methods. Gregory, however, continued to trust him, though he advised caution so that the religious would not be driven into deeper resentment. One of Ormanetto's greatest obstacles was simple ignorance. reliable information about the true condition of the monasteries was hard to obtain. Seeking a way around this, he encouraged the use of Jesuits to gather information discreetly about other religious orders. The king approved the idea and selected Gonzalo Melendez, rector of the Jesuit College at Madrid, to inspect Andalusia. Jesuit superiors tried to avoid the mission, sensing the danger, but pressure was applied and the work went forward. The results were disastrous. As soon as the religious understood the purpose of the visitation, anger erupted. The Jesuits came to be seen as newcomers, presuming to correct ancient and honoured orders. Complaints multiplied, tensions rose sharply, and stories circulated of large gatherings of monks discussing reprisals. The outcry became so intense that the Jesuit general intervened and insisted that his men should not be used in such a role without explicit papal direction. Gregory ultimately settled the issue in line with that view, but by then the harm had already been done. Melendez completed his tour, yet the hostility he encountered forced him out of Spain, and he later died at Naples. Ormanetto defended his decision by appealing to the king's wishes and to the urgent need for accurate information. Even so, resentment against the Jesuits had been deeply inflamed, and that resentment helps explain some of the tensions that appeared in later years. Not all of Ormanetto's reform efforts met such resistance. His work among the pre-Monstratensians in Spain proved more successful. At their chapters, he intervened personally and introduced practical measures that reshaped the order. Small houses with too few members were suppressed. The burden of caring for nuns was removed from them. The office of abbot was placed in more experienced hands, and proper novitiates were established. These changes strengthened the order internally, and afterward, both the Pope and the King expressed satisfaction with its condition. Even more important than these administrative reforms was Ormanetto's role in supporting a much greater spiritual renewal already underway in Spain: the transformation of the Carmelite order through Teresa of Jesus. Gregory XIII's age is inseparable from her story. Teresa, born Teresa de Ahumada in Avila in 1515, would become one of the most luminous personalities in the history of the Church. She died at Alba de Tormes on the very day the Gregorian calendar came into force in October 1582. In relation to religious life, two achievements of Gregory XIII stand above many others: his approval of Teresa's reform and his approval of the congregation founded by Philip Neri. Teresa's greatness cannot be reduced to one field alone. She was at once a writer, reformer, founder, mystic, organizer, and woman of extraordinary practical intelligence. Her works included an autobiography, an account of her foundations, many letters, poems, and spiritual treatises. She often wrote quickly in the middle of exhausting responsibilities, sometimes without even rereading what she had written. Yet the freshness, force, and grace of her style gave her a place among the great prose writers of Spain. In mystical theology, she reached a level that few before her had approached. She described inner prayer and the stages of spiritual growth with such clarity and depth that later writers often did little more than develop what she had already stated. Alongside her friend and disciple John of the Cross, she became one of the great teachers of the interior life. Her mind combined penetrating judgment with calmness, realism, and unusual self-knowledge. She understood law, human nature, daily needs, and the small practical details of life. These intellectual gifts were matched by the nobility of her character. Her life and writings reveal a soul deeply pure, easily moved by lofty moral and religious truths, yet strong enough to embrace sacrifice with joy. She faced hardship with courage, endured suffering with patience, and displayed a firmness often associated with the strongest men, while also retaining warmth and gentleness and a remarkable delicacy of spirit. She knew how to be frank without becoming harsh, and obedient without losing clarity. That balance can be seen in many moments of her life. She could dissuade an important benefactress from forcing an unsuitable novice upon her convent. She could write to the general of her order in a tone that combined respectful submission with honest criticism. When she returned to the convent of the Incarnation at Avila as its new superior, despite the resentment of many nuns, she won them over almost immediately through tact and intelligence. Again and again she showed a gift for finding the right word in difficult situations. The roots of this greatness could already be seen in childhood. In Avila, among its stern stone buildings and mountain air, she grew up under impressions that marked her for life. As a child, she and her brother read stories of the saints and martyrs and were captivated by the thought of eternal joy. The cry of forever stirred them so deeply that they set out, in childish innocence, hoping to reach Muslim lands and win martyrdom. When they were brought back, they built little hermitages for themselves and practiced prayer. After her mother's early death, however, other influences entered. Romances of chivalry and contact with worldly relatives awakened vanity and a desire to please. Yet her natural nobility protected her from serious moral collapse. At the Augustinian convent where her father sent her for education, the religious impressions of childhood revived. Even so, her final decision to embrace a religious life came only after inner struggle. And when she finally spoke to her father, she knew that her own sense of honour would never allow her to retreat. From 1535 onward, Teresa belonged to the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation at Avila. There she found joy in religious exercises, but her early years in the convent were marked by sickness, trial, and inner conflict. During a serious illness, she came so close to death that her grave was prepared. Even after recovering, she remained for a long time physically shattered and in constant pain. Later, when she regained strength, deeper spiritual struggles began. The convent was only loosely enclosed, and because its revenues were poor and its number of nuns very large, contact with outsiders was common. Teresa, cheerful and attractive in manner, was often called to the parlours and found herself enjoying worldly conversation. Her soul was divided. God drew her toward deeper prayer, but the world still retained a hold on her affections. Her father's death shook her. She returned to mental prayer, though only by forcing herself with extraordinary effort. Later, she recognized her own condition in the pages of Augustine, whose account of hesitation between God and the world seemed to describe her exactly. An image of Christ after the scourging also deeply affected her and helped detach her heart from earthly attachment. From that point, a new period began. She entered into the profound interior experiences that would later make her famous. Teresa described moments in which she felt entirely possessed by the presence of God, unable to doubt that he dwelt within her and that her soul was immersed in him. What followed included visions, locutions, and states of prayer in which she believed herself brought into direct contact with Christ and heavenly realities. She insisted, however, that these visions were not bodily sights. They belonged to the intellect and imagination, not to the physical eyes. They brought immense sweetness and strength, so much so that a single hour of such grace seemed to repay years of labour in prayer. Yet Teresa never made these experiences the centre of holiness. Again and again she said that love of God does not consist in tears or sweet feelings, but in humility, truth, determination, and faithful service. She even prayed at first that God would lead her by another path. These graces also caused her great suffering. She feared deception, especially from the devil, and at times those around her suspected the same. Jesuits who directed her early in this period gave her important reassurance, and Peter of Alcantara also brought her great peace. Still, she passed through terrible trials in which every memory of spiritual sweetness seemed to vanish, leaving only darkness and anguish. Ecstasy itself could feel like a kind of death. Her descriptions of these states carried unusual authority because she wrote with extreme sincerity and practical sanity. She warned against confusing imagination with revelation and cautioned that excessive fasting or lack of sleep could produce states mistaken for ecstasy. She recommended food, sleep, and moderation when needed. Those who met her were often surprised to find not an ethereal visionary, cut off from ordinary life, but a woman of sound judgment who ate, slept, spoke, and governed like anyone else. Her letters show constant attention to everyday matters, family concerns, illnesses, household arrangements, and the smallest practical needs. This sobriety gave weight to her spiritual testimony. She believed firmly that her experiences came from God because of their effects. They filled her with contempt for earthly vanities, courage for great undertakings, and a love of truth. They also prepared her for the work that would define the rest of her life, the reform of the Carmelites. Earlier efforts at Carmelite renewal had already appeared in different regions, but they often remained local and sometimes caused division within the order. This history made many leaders suspicious of new reform attempts. Teresa therefore faced not only difficulty, but an inheritance of mistrust. The decisive impulse came after a terrifying interior vision of hell. The impression it left on her was overwhelming. It filled her with gratitude for God's mercy, compassion for sinners, and a burning desire to live in such a way that she might obtain grace for others, especially for souls endangered by heresy and unbelief. She resolved first to observe the Carmelite rule more faithfully. Then, encouraged by visions, friends, and spiritual advisors, she moved toward founding a new house of strict observance. Permission was first granted, then withdrawn, and she found herself treated as a dreamer. Even her confessor ordered her to stop. But a decree obtained through high ecclesiastical channels eventually cleared the way, and in 1562 the little convent of St. Joseph at Avila was founded. This first house immediately met fierce resistance. Civic authorities wanted it suppressed, and Teresa herself was recalled to her old convent. The fact that she intended the house to live without fixed income caused special alarm. Yet papal and ecclesiastical approval protected the foundation, and with the help of learned defenders she overcame the opposition. There, in St. Joseph's, she spent some of the happiest years of her life. The rule was observed in full rigour, but the convent was not built on austerity alone. Teresa wanted its hidden life of prayer and sacrifice to serve the wider church, especially priests, missionaries, and the conversion of souls. Her encounter with a missionary recently returned from overseas widened this apostolic vision even further. Soon after, the Carmelite general Giovanni Battista Rossi visited Spain as part of broader reform efforts. When he saw St. Joseph's at Avila, he rejoiced at the recovery of ancient Carmelite simplicity and granted Teresa authority to found more houses. Hardly had he departed before another thought took hold of her. If the reformed convents of women were to flourish, there must also be reformed houses of men to support them. From that conviction came the beginning of the disculsed Carmelites. At Medina del Campo, Teresa met Antonio de Heredia, and through him the young Juan de Yepes, later known as John of the Cross. Born into poverty and shaped by hardship, John had known humiliation, labour, and want from childhood. He had been educated by the Jesuits while serving in a hospital and had entered the Carmelite order with a desire for severe observance. Teresa persuaded him not to leave for a stricter order, but to pursue holiness within Carmel itself. With him she found the essential collaborator for the reform of the friars. In a poor and remote house at Duruelo, two men began in 1568 the life of the discalced Carmelites. From then on, Teresa's activity widened astonishingly. Her mystical life continued, but it was now joined to ceaseless outward labour. With limited money, frail health, and immense obstacles, she crossed Spain, founding convent after convent. Sometimes she was helped by nobles, sometimes by merchants, sometimes by unexpected gifts. She negotiated with bishops, city councils, benefactors, and superiors. She endured delays, opposition, misunderstandings, and exhaustion. Yet between 1567 and 1582, she established a remarkable number of houses for women, while the reform among the friars also spread. This expansion, however, brought new conflict. The reform of the friars advanced with the support of visitors appointed in Spain, especially through the actions of Pedro Hernandez, and later others who favoured the new movement. Teresa herself was appointed prioress of the Incarnation at Avila, a sign of the respect she had gained, and the reform among the friars also spread into new houses. Yet these advances went beyond what the Carmelite general had originally intended. Older members of the order, already worried by the loss of fervent men to the reform, saw in this growth a threat to unity and authority. Tension sharpened. Legal rights, provincial boundaries, visitation powers, and rival loyalties all became entangled. When the general of the order secured a papal brief limiting the powers of the Spanish visitors, the struggle entered a new phase. The reform nevertheless found a powerful ally in the papal nuncio Ormanetto, who restored authority to one visitor and then associated with him, Jerome Gracian, one of the most energetic defenders of Teresa's cause. Gracian was young, talented, and full of zeal, and Teresa quickly recognized his value. But his rise also intensified hostility. To many, it seemed intolerable that a representative of a new and still controversial reform should exercise authority over an ancient order. From this point onward, the conflict surrounding the Carmelite reform would become sharper, more public, and more difficult. Even so, the larger reality remained unmistakable. Gregory XIII's age was one of deep religious reorganization, and in that world, Teresa of Jesus stood as one of its most powerful spiritual forces. Gregory did not create her reform, but he gave it the legal room to survive. He governed at a time when new congregations were rising, old orders were being corrected, and the Church was seeking both discipline and renewal after a century of crisis. In that effort, his support for the Theatines, the Capuchins, the Basilians, and many other communities formed one side of his legacy. The other side was his recognition of living holiness, where it appeared with undeniable force. In Teresa's reform, as in the wider Catholic renewal of the age, his pontificate helped shape institutions that would endure long after the struggles of his own lifetime had passed. As the Carmelite leadership prepared to gather in Piacenza, a decisive shift was already underway. Earlier that year, a papal authorization granted the head of the order sweeping authority to intervene wherever discipline was being challenged. While it called for a return to authentic observance, it also empowered action against communities that had developed independently of central control. When the assembly met during Pentecost in 1575, its intentions became unmistakably clear. The newly established reformed houses outside Castile were ordered to be dissolved. Their members were instructed to abandon those foundations and return immediately to their original convents. A visitor was sent to Spain with the explicit goal of enforcing these decisions, and his mission was not merely administrative. It aimed directly at dismantling the reform movement. Interestingly, the decrees remained silent regarding the communities of nuns. Yet their impact was still deeply felt. Around the same time, Teresa was instructed to choose a single convent for permanent residence and was forbidden from leaving it. The restriction extended to all reformed Carmelite nuns. effectively halting the expansion of the movement. She settled in Toledo, and for several years her work as a founder came to a complete standstill. Despite these measures, the situation on the ground proved far more complex. Earlier papal delegations still held authority, and their presence limited the effectiveness of the visitor sent to impose the new decrees. Meanwhile, support for the reform remained strong in influential circles. As long as key allies were active, the movement not only survived, but continued to strengthen quietly. Yet tension within the order was growing. One of the central weaknesses of the reform became increasingly apparent. It lacked independence. The reformed communities were still governed by leaders who did not share their vision. This created instability and the constant risk of reversal. Teresa recognized this clearly and began pushing for structural autonomy. She argued that the reform could only endure if it had its own leadership, and she identified a capable figure to take on that role. Efforts to advance this vision led to bold and controversial actions. New authority was granted to reform leaders, even over unreformed communities. This move triggered fierce resistance. When attempts were made to enforce changes, opposition quickly escalated. Complaints were sent to Rome, questioning both the legitimacy and the qualifications of those leading the reform. At the same time, regional authorities within the order introduced new policies designed to weaken the distinction between the two groups. Members of both sides were ordered to live together, despite their different practices. If implemented fully, this would have gradually erased the reform altogether. The response from the reformed communities was immediate. They organized their own assembly and introduced a unified set of internal regulations. These were carefully shaped to reflect their spiritual vision and to eliminate inconsistencies between different houses. Although developed by one of their leaders, these guidelines were deeply influenced by Teresa's direction. Even in isolation, her influence remained powerful. From her convent, she maintained constant communication through letters. She encouraged perseverance, corrected excesses, and coordinated strategy across the movement. The volume of correspondence was immense, often pushing her physical limits. She also understood that the struggle would ultimately be decided in Rome. If only one side presented its case, the outcome would be inevitable. She urged her companions to act quickly and send representatives to defend their position. But delays proved costly. A turning point came with the death of a key supporter. His replacement viewed the reform with suspicion and hostility. Under the new leadership, restrictions intensified. Reform leaders were removed from their positions. New foundations were prohibited, and authority was handed back to those opposed to the movement. The pressure escalated further. Communities that supported the reform faced severe penalties. Even respected figures were imprisoned. What had once seemed a promising renewal now appeared on the brink of collapse. At the same time, internal disagreements added to the crisis. Questions arose about authority and legitimacy. Legal opinions were divided, and confusion spread. In a controversial move, reform leaders declared independence on their own initiative, establishing separate governance and attempting to formalize their position. However, this action only provoked stronger opposition and failed to achieve recognition. For a moment, everything seemed lost. Then, unexpectedly, the situation changed. Influence from powerful allies, including the monarchy, began to shift the balance. Gradually, attitudes softened. Decisions were reconsidered. A new directive emerged that protected the reform from external control and granted it provisional autonomy. Encouraged by this development, representatives were finally sent to Rome to secure official recognition. Their journey was cautious and discreet. They operated quietly, aware of the delicate political environment. When the matter reached the highest level of review, Debate was intense. Alternative solutions were proposed, including compromise arrangements that would preserve unity while sharing leadership. At first, these ideas seemed likely to prevail, but persistent advocacy and strategic intervention changed the outcome. In the end, the decision aligned with the original vision of the reform. In 1580, formal approval was granted. The Reformed Carmelites were officially recognized as a separate province with their own leadership and structure. What had once been fragile and uncertain was now firmly established. By the following year, the new organization was fully operational. Its leadership was confirmed, its regulations defined, and its identity secured. The movement had grown significantly, with hundreds of members and numerous communities. For Teresa, this marked the completion of her life's work. Though she continued to found new convents, the essential struggle had already been won. Her vision extended beyond structure and discipline. At its core was a deeper ideal, the union of contemplation and action. She believed that spiritual life should not withdraw from the world entirely, but should strengthen engagement with it. Prayer and service were not opposing paths, but complementary ones. This principle became the defining characteristic of the Reform. Even enclosed communities saw their mission as connected to the wider world, offering their spiritual efforts for the good of others. Among the friars, this spirit inspired preaching, teaching, and even missionary work far beyond Europe. Yet the future would bring new tensions. After her death, leadership passed into different hands. A new direction emphasized stricter enclosure and reduced external activity. Missionary efforts were scaled back, and the order took on a more contemplative focus, particularly within Spain. Ironically, the broader vision she had championed would flourish elsewhere. New foundations outside Spain carried forward her original ideals, blending deep interior life with active engagement. From these centres, the Reform gained renewed influence and lasting significance. Philip Neri understood that his work could not depend on one life alone. If the spiritual energy he had awakened in Rome was to endure, it needed a body of priests who could carry it forward after him. Yet his humility held him back for many years. He did not set out with the ambition of founding a formal institution, and for a long time he resisted anything that looked like personal authority. Even so, circumstances gradually pushed him toward that role. By the late 1550s, several priests at San Girolamo already regarded him as their real guide. This circle widened further in the early 1560s, when a group of priests living in community and serving the Church of San Giovanni dei Fiorentini asked that Philip be placed over them. Papal instruction made it impossible for him to refuse. Some of his closest followers were sent there, including Cesare Baronius, newly ordained at the time. For years these priests remained closely tied to Philip, returning regularly for the exercises of the Oratory and for his spiritual direction, until a separate oratory was eventually built for them at their own church. Life among Philip's disciples was marked by simplicity, discipline, and cheerful humility. At San Giovanni, they took turns serving in the kitchen, each one accepting ordinary household work as part of the common life. It was in this setting that Baronius, embracing the task with joy, left behind the playful inscription declaring himself the kitchen's perpetual cook. Such details were not trivial in Philip's world. They revealed the spirit he wanted to form in others, a spirit that combined humility with gladness and devotion with a willingness to accept the smallest duties without complaint. What mattered to him was never outer status, but the reshaping of the heart. As the number of priests around him grew, Philip still did not think in terms of founding a congregation. He was content to guide souls, preach, hear confessions, and let things develop naturally. But an unpleasant episode forced the question upon him. One priest, who had been received into the house at San Giovanni, Philip was later dismissed because he proved unfit for the life there. In anger, the man spread slanders against Philip and his followers so effectively that the Florentine community in Rome was nearly driven to remove him from the church altogether. The incident made one truth impossible to ignore. As long as Philip and his companions had no church and house that truly belonged to them, their work rested on unstable ground. Under the pressure of his disciples, Philip finally agreed to accept one of the churches that had been offered to him. The final choice was made in favour of Santa Maria in Vallicella. That decision changed everything. In the summer of 1575, the church and its revenues were formally granted to Philip and his companions. This act became the legal beginning of the Congregation of the Oratory. Rather than repair the small and dilapidated church already standing there, Philip chose to replace it entirely. A larger and more beautiful building rose in its place. The church, later known everywhere as the Chiesa Nuova. The new foundation slowly took material shape. By the beginning of 1578, the community already numbered several dozen priests and lay brothers. Some of Philip's closest disciples moved there early, but Philip himself delayed taking up residence. Only in the early 1580s, and then at papal urging, did he finally settle in the new house. True to character, he selected the poorest and least comfortable rooms for himself. The community he shaped was unlike the great religious orders of the age. Philip did not want it turned into a conventional order, and it never became one. Its members took no vows. They remained secular priests, kept ownership of their property, and contributed freely to the common life in a spirit modelled on the earliest Christian communities. Anyone who wished could leave. The bond that held them together was not legal compulsion, but charity. That charity was expected to be so real and so strong that it would produce the same practical obedience and self-discipline that other communities sought through vows. There was no superior general ruling a worldwide structure. Each oratory remained independent, governing itself and electing its own superior. Philip himself later came to be recognized as the common father of the Roman house. But even then, the institution preserved its distinctive freedom and flexibility. Its customs were not fully written down during his lifetime. They would only be fixed more formally after his death. Philip had never planned for the oratory to spread widely, yet its spirit proved attractive enough to take root elsewhere. An early attempt to establish it in Milan failed because Philip and Charles Borromeo differed over how the new foundation should function. Borromeo wanted tighter episcopal control and hoped to use the Oratorians in ways Philip did not approve, particularly in visitations and clerical examinations. Philip, therefore, withdrew them. Even so, the expansion he had not sought gradually came. New oratories appeared in several Italian cities and eventually beyond Italy as well. The movement spread not by grand design, but because the form of life Philip had created answered a real need. Its combination of prayer, fraternity, freedom, and practical pastoral work had lasting power. Although Philip had once renounced the world of learning and literary ambition for the sake of God, his influence upon scholarship became profound. The evening meetings of the oratory included talks on religious subjects, and since not all the speakers were trained theologians, attention often turned to the lives of the saints and the history of the Church. Philip deliberately encouraged this. He ordered the young Baronius, still a layman at the time, to speak each evening on church history. Baronius would have preferred more directly devotional subjects, but Philip insisted and held him firmly to that path. Over the course of many years, Baronius reviewed the entire sweep of ecclesiastical history, again and again, until the field became second nature to him. What began as obedience in the oratory became preparation for one of the great historical projects of the age. Philip had grasped something important before many others did. The great Protestant historical works of the period were trying to use the past as a weapon, presenting the history of the Church as a story of corruption and decline from original Christianity. He saw that such a challenge could not be answered merely with scattered polemics. It required a vast and serious work of history in return. He therefore pressed Baronius into the labour of composing a full church history that would meet that challenge on equal ground. The task was enormous, and Baronius resisted it with real distress, doubting his own strength. Philip did not yield. He urged, pushed, corrected, and compelled him to continue. Later, Baronius would publicly declare that the true inspiration and direction of his great historical work belonged above all to Philip. He regarded himself as the instrument, but Philip as the mind that had seen the danger, conceived the answer, and formed the hand that would carry it out. Philip's influence on Christian scholarship extended beyond history into archaeology and the study of sacred antiquity. The same love for the early church that marked his spirituality also shaped the interests of his followers. His reverence for the martyrs, for the catacombs, and for the memory of ancient Christian Rome left a deep impression on the men around him. Through disciples connected to his circle, important early work on the catacombs was preserved and published. In this way, the spirit of the Oratory helped open new paths in the rediscovery of Christian Rome. Philip also founded the library at the Vallicella, one of the earliest libraries in the city to serve a wider public. His legacy in this field was not that of a scholar seeking fame, but of a spiritual father whose instinct led learning back toward the life of the Church. Music, too, was transformed by the world he created. Philip loved music because he saw in it a way of lifting the soul toward God. He gladly included sacred singing in the meetings of the Oratory and attracted gifted musicians to serve this purpose. Giovanni Animuccia, an important composer and master of music, wrote collections of spiritual songs, especially for these gatherings. These pieces were marked by a simplicity suited to devotion and to a broad audience. As the Oratory's meetings grew more popular and drew people from many walks of life, the music used then naturally tended toward clarity and immediacy. In this setting, sacred music began to move away from the densely woven style of earlier polyphony and toward forms that gave more space to melody, expression, and intelligibility. Out of that environment there emerged something even more significant. The devotional performances associated with the Oratory helped prepare the way for a new kind of sacred musical drama. At first, these gatherings used hymns and lyrical songs, but gradually biblical narratives and sacred stories began to be shaped musically in a more extended and dramatic form. That development would later lead to what became known as the oratorio, a genre that joined sacred narrative with musical meditation. It was not born from Philip's deliberate artistic program, but from the living devotional culture he had fostered. The very name of the form came from the place in which such works were first performed. In that sense, Philip's humble prayer meetings ended up contributing to one of the great developments in Western sacred music. By the time the congregation of the Oratory had taken shape, Philip himself had entered the serene final period of a life marked by hardship, struggle, and extraordinary fruitfulness. His earlier years in Rome had not been easy. He had faced suspicion, hostility, and attempts to drive him from the very places where he served. There were moments when he seriously wondered whether he should leave Rome altogether and devote himself to missionary work abroad. Under a suspicious papal regime, he had even been forbidden for a time to hear confessions or lead his public pilgrimages. Yet all of that lay behind him now. The years of sowing had given way to the years of harvest. Popes esteemed him. Cardinals sought him out. Great men of the Church showed him honour. But he never ceased to live in the same simplicity as before. His influence reached through every layer of Roman society. Cardinals, noble families, founders of religious communities, future saints, and ordinary people all came under his direction. Roman aristocratic households trusted him deeply. Men and women of rank saw in him not a courtly figure, but a father of souls. Others, who would later be recognized for holiness, found in him either a friend, a guide, or a companion in the work of reform. His authority did not rest on softness alone. He was warm and lovable, but never indulgent in a shallow sense. With beginners he was gentle and demanded only what was necessary. With those who had truly given themselves to his guidance, he could be exacting. He wanted not gloomy severity, but deep interior conversion. He cared less for dramatic outward mortifications than for the death of pride, obstinacy, vanity, and self-will. That is why some of his actions could seem startling. He sometimes used deliberate gestures that shattered dignity and self-importance, both in himself and in others. What looked strange on the surface had a spiritual purpose. He was attacking that hidden hunger for esteem that poisons religious life. He believed that a person who could not bear the loss of worldly honour for the sake of Christ would never advance far in the spiritual life. Beneath the humour and unpredictability there was a coherent method, one aimed at freedom from pride. Philip's sanctity was full of joy, but it was not sentimental. It asked for real surrender. Until the end of his life, the reverence people felt for him only increased. Even those who had known him most closely for many years did not outgrow their admiration. If anything, intimacy revealed his greatness more clearly. Borromeo, Tarugi, future popes, cardinals, and countless penitents found that prolonged contact with Philip did not diminish his stature. His final years were spent entirely for others. Old age did not narrow his world. He remained, even into his 80s, one of the great spiritual forces of Rome. His reach extended from the papal court to the streets of the city. He belonged at once to the highest and the lowest, to scholars and labourers, to nobles and children. Yet, in his own eyes, he remained a sinner who had done nothing worthy of praise. On his deathbed, he regretted only that people had thought too highly of him. When the Eucharist was brought to him, he spoke with deep humility and insisted that he was unworthy. This self-understanding was not theatrical. It belonged to the centre of his life. The man so widely honoured never ceased to judge himself before God, with simplicity and fear. That humility explains much about the extraordinary purity of his influence. He never tried to dominate the Church by violence of temperament or by dramatic denunciation. He did not present himself as a prophet of destruction, nor as a rebel against corruption. He answered the crisis of his age not with thunder, but with holiness. That is what makes Philip Neri stand apart. In a century filled with reformers of every kind, he offered a very different model. He loved the early church with intensity, but he did not use antiquity as a weapon against the living church. He did not dream of tearing institutions apart in the name of purity. What he wanted was to recover the spirit of the first Christians through humility, sacrifice, charity, and burning love for God. He did not reform by storm. He reformed by attraction. He did not despise the priesthood because some priests were sinful. He held the priesthood in such awe that he counted himself unworthy of it. When treated unjustly by ecclesiastical authority, he did not answer with revolt, but with obedience. His strength was not the force that breaks, it was the force that heals. Through gentleness, joy, patience, and supernatural charity, Philip gradually transformed the religious life of Rome. What began among the poor, the neglected, and the spiritually hungry expanded almost without design into something that touched the whole church. Popes respected him. Scholars and artists owed much to him. Great families trusted him. Ordinary Romans loved him. He gave up everything for God, and in return his work bore fruit beyond anything he had sought. In the memory of his contemporaries and in the judgment of later generations, he remained an almost flawless figure, not because he lacked humanity, but because every part of that humanity had been illuminated by grace. The arrival of pilgrims from San Genesio was not a quiet or ordinary event. It unfolded as a powerful and deeply symbolic procession, welcomed by one of Rome's most renowned confraternities, the Gonfaloni. What followed was not merely a march, but a vivid expression of faith, discipline, and religious imagination. At the very front walked penitents, moving slowly behind a large crucifix. They practiced acts of self-discipline as they went, a striking reminder of devotion and sacrifice. Behind them came members of various confraternities dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the Holy Trinity, and the Blessed Sacrament. All were barefoot. Ashes covered their heads. Their garments, white, black, and blue, created a sombre yet unified image. The procession then transformed into something almost theatrical. Figures from sacred history appeared one after another, each carefully dressed and carrying symbolic objects. The Archangel Michael stood in shining armour, holding both sword and scales. Adam and Eve followed, marked by the fruit that defined their story. Noah carried the ark, while Abraham bore the knife of sacrifice and Isaac the wood. More figures emerged, each representing a moment from ancient scripture. Jacob appeared with a ladder, Moses with the tablets of the law, Aaron with a censer. Warriors, prophets, and kings followed, Joshua, Gideon, Samson, David, each bringing their own symbols of struggle and faith. Job appeared covered in wounds. Judith carried the head of her enemy. Jeremiah walked in solemn robes. Then came the New Testament. Children represented the innocents lost under Herod. John the Baptist walked with a simple cross, proclaiming the coming of the Lamb of God. The four evangelists followed, holding their books, accompanied by the great teachers of the Church, Gregory, Jerome, Ambrose, and Augustine. At the end of the procession came its most striking feature, a moving structure symbolizing the triumph of the Church. It appeared almost alive as it advanced. Designed like Noah's Ark, it was covered with images and allegories. At its highest point stood the figure of the Pope, holding an orb and offering a blessing. Around him were personifications of virtues, prudence, justice, and charity, each reinforcing the message of moral authority and spiritual order. The imagery extended further. Scenes depicted moments of reconciliation and leadership from earlier centuries. Above all, a message was carried forward: the enduring strength of the Church through time, guided by its leaders, and sustained by faith. This kind of symbolic display was not unique. Similar scenes appeared in other processions, including those organized for children. Groups from different cities brought their own interpretations, blending devotion with creativity. Some were especially noted for their sincerity and for correcting earlier impressions of religious division. In many of these events, the presence of nobility stood out. Members of elite families joined alongside ordinary citizens, all participating with visible devotion. At the same time, another procession told a very different story: the poor, the sick, the blind, and the disabled, moving together in quiet dignity. Their presence stirred compassion throughout the city. Pilgrims from distant lands added to the atmosphere. Some were remembered for their remarkable devotion. Others included artists, writers, and figures of culture who came to witness the sacred spaces of Rome. To guide their journey, many carried detailed maps showing the major churches of the city. These illustrations presented each sacred site in sequence, often depicting pilgrims kneeling in reverence before them. The experience was both spiritual and visual, carefully structured yet deeply personal. Visitors were often overwhelmed, not only by the grandeur of Rome's churches and relics, but by the sheer number of religious communities active within the city. Monks, friars, and priests from many different traditions could be seen everywhere. Alongside them stood lay confraternities, each identified by distinct colours and roles. Some wore black, others white, red, blue, yellow, or green. Each group had its own purpose, yet all contributed to a shared religious life that felt vibrant and fully alive. During major celebrations, thousands of members from these groups would gather, forming an extraordinary display of unity and discipline. Their presence reflected a society deeply shaped by religious identity and communal responsibility. Behind all of this stood strong organisation and leadership. Pilgrims were cared for with remarkable efficiency. Food, shelter, and guidance were provided on a massive scale, yet without visible disorder. The system worked smoothly, even under the pressure of immense crowds. At the same time, spiritual care was given equal importance. Churches remained open late into the night. Confessors were always available. Preachers spoke with intensity, addressing both moral struggles and the hope of renewal. Their words echoed through the city, calling people toward reflection and change. The results were visible. Many sought forgiveness. Others turned away from harmful ways of life. Acts of generosity increased. People gave not only money, but time and effort. Some hosted pilgrims in their homes. Others served them directly, even performing humble tasks with sincerity. One institution became especially important in this effort: a confraternity dedicated to welcoming pilgrims without distinction. It received thousands of people, sometimes in a single day, yet maintained order and care throughout. Its success depended not only on organisation, but on widespread support from both leaders and ordinary citizens. This spirit of charity extended across the city. Wealthy individuals contributed generously. Noble families took part personally in acts of service. Women from prominent households cared for female pilgrims, offering assistance with humility and dedication. The atmosphere created by these efforts was widely admired. Observers described it as both moving and inspiring, a city where faith was not only preached, but practiced in daily life. Even during times of hardship, this spirit endured. While disease affected other regions, Rome remained largely untouched. Many saw this as a sign of protection, though it was also the result of careful management and collective discipline. On December 12, 1583, a consistory gathered in Rome. Once the ordinary matters had been settled and the cardinals were preparing to leave, Pope Gregory XIII spoke in a grave and deliberate tone. He told them that, although his health remained strong and he had every reason to expect more years of life, he had learned that some ambitious members of the Sacred College were already engaging in the usual manoeuvring over the choice of the next pope. Such behaviour, he warned, carried serious ecclesiastical penalties. Even so, he chose to pardon those involved one more time. But he also made it clear that he would act at once to prevent any further intrigue. Without advanced discussion and without inviting debate, he announced that he had decided on a major new creation of cardinals, so that the new appointees could appear publicly during the approaching Christmas celebrations. He then read out a list of 19 names, including Giovanni Antonio Facchinetti, Gian Battista Castagna, Alessandro de' Medici, Rodrigo de Castro, François de Joyeuse, Michele della Torre, Giulio Canani, Niccolò Sfondrati, Antonio Maria Salviati, Agostino Valiero, Vincenzo Laureo, Filippo Spinola, Alberto Bolognetti, Giorgio Radziwiłł, Matteo Contarelli, Simone Tagliavia d'Aragona, Scipione Lancellotti, Charles de Bourbon-Vendôme, and Francesco Sforza di Santa Fiora. The announcement shocked the Sacred College. many of the cardinals were not only surprised, but openly irritated by the Pope's decision to proceed without consulting them beforehand. The first and strongest protest came from Cardinal Farnese, who spoke as Dean of the College. He said that filling the vacant places was reasonable and even necessary, and he himself had urged that this should be done. Yet he argued that, out of respect for the chief senate of the Church and in keeping with long-established custom, the cardinals should have been informed beforehand so that each might offer an opinion. Gregory answered directly that he had avoided prior notice, precisely to spare everyone long and exhausting arguments. Farnese acknowledged the Pope's full authority to act as he wished, but still insisted that the traditional practice had been ignored. Gregory made only one concession. Since several cardinals had been absent through illness, he agreed that their supplementary votes might later be gathered. Even then, however, he did not alter his nominations. The tension did not end there. Cardinals Santori and Gambara, both closely connected with the Inquisition, raised objections to two of the nominees, Radziwiłł and Bourbon, on the grounds of their family background. Gregory brushed the criticism aside. He said plainly that he already knew their circumstances and that both men were distinguished in every respect. Others tried to press the claims of different candidates, among them Fabio Mirto Frangipani. But the Pope gave no more than a polite assurance that he would remember such names in future. After about an hour, the meeting came to an end. In the end, despite the resentment it caused, the consistory had changed the balance of the Sacred College in a decisive way. The choice of these new cardinals had been shaped by many different motives, and naturally it drew sharp criticism in the Roman Curia. Of the foreigners, the Spanish candidates, Rodrigo de Castro and Tagliavia d'Aragona, were promoted in accordance with the wishes of Philip II. François de Joyeuse was elevated in response to the interests of Henry III of France, though the French king had hoped for a different choice than Bourbon. Matteo Contarelli, though French by birth, was rewarded chiefly for the administrative services he had rendered in Rome. The Emperor Rudolph II had supported Spinola. The inclusion of Radziwiłł was widely seen as justified, both because of the wishes of King Stephen Bathory and because of Radziwiłł's own role in strengthening Catholicism. Among the Italians, Gregory was careful to distribute honours across the peninsula, rather than concentrate them too heavily in any one region. He also avoided the common accusation that a pope favoured too many men from his own homeland. Several of these appointments would later prove especially significant. 4 of the men named that day eventually became popes. Facchinetti became Innocent IX, Castagna became Urban VII, Medici became Leo XI, and Sfondrati became Gregory XIV. Aside from Francesco Sforza, whose advancement was widely linked to his relationship with the Boncompagni family, most of the rest were generally recognized as capable and worthy men. Not long after this great creation, another promotion followed when Andrew Bathory received the Red Hat on July 4th. Then, in quick succession, the Sacred College was struck by the loss of several important figures. Zaccaria Delfino died in December 1583. Luigi Cornaro followed in May 1584. Then Claude de la Baume in June, Charles Borromeo in November, and Giovanni Commendone in December of the same year. Among these deaths, the loss of Borromeo weighed most heavily. He was only 46, yet his death was felt as a severe blow not only to Milan, but also to Gregory XIII and to the wider Church. The Pope was deeply moved. He ordered that full reports should be prepared on Borromeo's charitable work and his reforms, because he wanted those efforts to continue in the same spirit. Gregory XIII's wider religious policy helps explain why he reacted with such seriousness to questions of reform and succession. He believed that the renewal of Catholic life depended above all on education, discipline, and the formation of a blameless clergy. For that reason, he showed exceptional favour to the Society of Jesus. In his eyes, the Jesuits had already proved their value in teaching, preaching, missionary work, and the moral strengthening of the Church. He restored privileges that had been altered under an earlier pontificate and confirmed the society in its special character. After the death of Francis Borgia, the Jesuits elected Everard Mercurian as Superior General, and later Claudio Acquaviva. Under both men, the order continued to enjoy the Pope's active support. Gregory issued fresh confirmations, protected Jesuit customs, and strengthened their legal position. He also poured resources into their houses and colleges, to such an extent that irritation toward the order began to spread not only among Protestants, who already hated it, but even among some Catholics, who saw the society gaining too much favour. Yet Gregory was unmoved by complaints. He believed the Jesuit colleges served the deepest aims of the Catholic revival. His letters to nuncios, bishops, princes, and cathedral chapters show how constantly he acted on their behalf. In many regions, especially in Germany and Switzerland, the order received a stronger footing because of direct papal support. The same pattern repeated itself elsewhere. In Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, the Low Countries, Poland, Transylvania, and even in distant mission lands such as Japan, Gregory backed Jesuit foundations with money, privileges, and public encouragement. He helped raise their institutions at places like Wilna and Pont-à-Mousson, and he consistently treated education as one of the central battles of the age. Nowhere is his vision seen more clearly than in the revival of the German College in Rome. The original purpose of that institution had been to train learned and upright priests for the defence and restoration of the faith in the German lands. Over time, however, its direction had shifted, and its financial footing had become uncertain. Some even suggested that the college, at least in its earlier form, should be abandoned. Gregory XIII chose the opposite course, persuaded especially by Cardinal Otto Truchsess, and reinforced in his decision by experienced observers such as Peter Canisius. He resolved not merely to preserve the German college, but to rebuild it on a larger and firmer foundation. Plans were laid in 1573 to expand the number of students dramatically. Soon afterward, the college was re-established, with a substantial annual revenue, new housing, and the experienced direction of the Jesuits. It was intended for 100 students drawn from across Germany and neighbouring northern lands, and it was equipped to teach languages, philosophy, theology, and canon law. It received privileges that placed it under direct papal protection and gave it rights comparable to those of the Roman University. Gregory personally took an active role in its development. He visited the establishment, provided the funds for its expenses, and later gave it further buildings and endowments that secured a lasting income. Very quickly, the college flourished. Students came from almost every diocese in Germany. Its internal discipline, its religious formation, its academic standards, and even its cultivation of sacred music made it a model that others admired. It was increasingly seen as a pattern for seminaries elsewhere. Gregory's support of the German college became so important that he was later regarded as its second founder. Without waiting for meaningful help from the princes of Germany, he had assumed the burden himself, convinced that this was one of the surest ways to sustain Catholic life in lands under pressure from religious division. The success of the German college encouraged Gregory to take similar steps for other nations. A Hungarian college was first conceived separately, then permanently united with the German institution. New laws gave this combined German-Hungarian college a stable framework regulating admissions, discipline, studies, spiritual life, and administration in great detail. Students were drawn from specific regions that most needed trained clergy, and the structure of their education was carefully planned so they could return as priests prepared to defend and restore the faith. One distinctive feature of the college was the solemn obligation imposed on students to accept ordination, to return home when called, and to devote themselves to ecclesiastical service, rather than secular ambition. England, where persecution made local seminaries nearly impossible, demanded a different answer. Gregory already supported the English seminary at Douai with large annual subsidies, but he wanted more. So he founded an English college in Rome, gave it an income, attached further revenues to it, and placed it under papal protection. Though internal disputes later troubled the college and conflicts emerged between different groups of students and their superiors, its long-term importance was immense. Those educated there were prepared not for comfort, but for danger. Many would return to England knowing that prison, torture, and execution were real possibilities. The formation they received in Rome was shaped by that reality, and the college became one of the great training grounds of the English Catholic resistance. Gregory's concern for education did not stop with these famous institutions. In Germany itself, he encouraged the growth of seminaries attached to Jesuit houses in Vienna, Prague, Graz, Olomouc, Braunsberg, Fulda, and Dillingen. The same idea guided his support for seminaries in Italy, including important help given to Naples and Venice, as well as to institutions for Dalmatia and Illyria. In Milan, at the request of Charles Borromeo, he founded the Swiss College to strengthen Catholic life in the Swiss regions connected with the Milanese Church. The same broad vision reached still farther east. A Greek college was founded in Rome to educate clergy and laymen of the Greek rite and to assist both the preservation of Eastern Catholics and hopes for reunion with the Orthodox world. Gregory endowed it generously, gave it buildings, supported its worship according to the Greek rite, and followed its progress closely. He also established colleges for Maronites and Armenians, and a house in Rome for converts from Judaism and Islam. All of this led naturally to one of his greatest achievements, the transformation of the Roman college itself. Gregory came to see that the many national colleges he had supported still depended on a central institution in Rome for instruction and intellectual formation. The Roman college, however, was burdened by debt and inadequate buildings. Once the need was pressed on him, Gregory decided to act decisively. He cleared its debts, endowed it more securely, and began the construction of an immense new building designed on a scale worthy of its universal mission. When he blessed the new structure in person, the event was treated not merely as an architectural undertaking, but as a statement of Catholic purpose. This was to be a centre of higher learning for the Church at large, not just for the city of Rome. It was meant to serve many nations and to train generations of theologians, pastors, scholars, and missionaries. The Roman college quickly justified such expectations. It educated not only Jesuits, but also students from the German-Hungarian College, the English College, the Roman Seminary, and other institutions. Its professors included some of the most important scholars of the age. Its lectures drew large audiences, and from its teaching emerged major theological works that shaped Catholic thought for generations. In time, it formed popes, cardinals, bishops, missionaries, and saints. Gregory's role in all this was so central that he came to be honoured as the second founder of the institution. The scale of his support was admired by many contemporaries, though it also drew criticism from those who resented the use of ecclesiastical revenues for education or distrusted the influence of the Jesuits. That criticism could be intense. Some in the Curia complained that too much money was being poured into colleges, that some of the buildings were too grand, or that church benefices were being diverted in questionable ways. Gregory ignored these attacks. He believed that reviving the clergy through disciplined education was one of the surest ways to restore the church. One defender of his policy argued powerfully that colleges were the spiritual equivalent of charitable institutions, where hospitals and similar works relieved bodily suffering. Seminaries and colleges protected souls and preserved the faith. This defense also answered the charge that the Jesuits had been favored too much. Their enemies might resent them, but their results spoke for themselves. In regions shaken by religious upheaval, graduates of these colleges were often among the strongest defenders of Catholicism. In some lands, they preserved what remained of the old faith. In others, they brought back many who had drifted away. Gregory XIII never abandoned this vision. Even late in life, he was still planning new colleges and seminaries, including projects for Luxembourg, Bologna, Ireland, and the peoples of the Balkans. He saw education not as a secondary matter, but as one of the decisive fronts on which the future of the Church would be fought. That is why he supported these institutions with such persistence, and why he treated them with something like paternal affection. He visited them, endowed them, defended them, and expanded them. To his critics, this seemed excessive. To Gregory, it was necessary. In his mind, no investment yielded more lasting results than the formation of learned, disciplined, and loyal clergy. Buildings might rise and fall, political alliances might fail, and money given for temporary causes might disappear. But what was spent on the training of souls, he believed, could not be lost. In that conviction lay one of the clearest and most enduring features of his pontificate. Gregory XIII was not simply a ruler of the Church. He was also a man of learning, a pope who carried a scholar's habits into old age and continued to value study, even while bearing the full weight of his office. He believed that the renewal of Catholic life could not be separated from the renewal of knowledge. In his view, learning was not an ornament of religion, but one of its strongest defences. If the Church was to recover its authority, dignity, and cultural force, then scholars, teachers, historians, linguists, and editors had to be supported with the same seriousness as bishops and administrators. For that reason, he became one of the great patrons of intellectual life in the late 16th century. Though his personal training inclined him especially toward law, his protection reached far beyond legal studies. He encouraged work in theology, history, classical scholarship, biblical studies, medicine, philosophy, mathematics, languages, liturgy, and antiquarian research. In matters of scholarship, he frequently listened to trusted advisors, especially men such as Cardinal Spoleto, Antonio Carafa, and Contarelli, whose judgment helped shape his choices. Around him gathered a remarkable circle of learned men, and his generosity extended across a wide range of disciplines. Italian scholars benefited in great numbers, but his patronage was never limited to Italy alone. He saw the Catholic world as a single intellectual field, and he tried to strengthen it wherever talent appeared. Many of the finest minds of the age found in Gregory XIII a supporter ready to reward merit with office, income, or direct financial assistance. Some received church benefices, others pensions, others commissions that allowed them to continue their research. His circle included major historians, philologists, mathematicians, editors, canonists, physicians, and men of letters. He valued both traditional scholarship and more specialized branches of inquiry. Among those close to him was Andrea Mercati, a friend of Philip Neri, whom the Pope entrusted with the foundation of a natural science collection in the Vatican. This was a striking sign of Gregory's curiosity, for it showed that his patronage was not confined to strictly devotional subjects. At the same time, he extended his favour to scholars from across Europe. Distinguished French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, English, Scottish, and Netherlandish figures all came within the orbit of his support. He protected renowned exegetes and theologians, among them Juan Maldonado, whose enemies he defended against with sharp determination. Gregory summoned him to Rome for work connected with the new edition of the Septuagint, making clear that scholarly service to Scripture belonged to the highest priorities of the papal court. Other celebrated thinkers, including Martin Azpilcueta and Pedro de Fonseca, enjoyed his esteem, as did pious interpreters of Scripture from the religious orders. The Pope was not merely honouring famous names, he was actively gathering intellectual resources for a wider Catholic revival. His ambitions in scholarship were especially visible in his treatment of history. In the autumn of 1578, he called the humanist and historian Carlo Sigonio to Rome. Sigonio already had a strong reputation for serious historical work and a disciplined respect for evidence. Gregory wanted him to undertake a truthful history of the Church, a project tied to the broader Catholic response against Protestant historical attacks. This desire reveals something essential about Gregory's mind. He did not see history as a decorative subject for educated conversation. He regarded it as a battlefield. The struggle over the past had become part of the struggle over doctrine, legitimacy, and memory. Protestant writers had launched vast narratives designed to present the papacy as corruption added onto original Christianity. Catholic scholars, therefore, needed not only piety and loyalty, but mastery of sources. Sigonio was one answer to that need. But another, perhaps even more important, had already been chosen through the influence of Philip Neri. That man was Cesare Borronius. While Sigonio was being drawn into historical work, Borronius was patiently building the foundations of a far larger project. With access to manuscripts and encouragement from powerful churchmen, he was preparing the work that would become one of the monumental achievements of Catholic historiography. Gregory supported him, and Borronius himself wrote of revising and perfecting his ecclesiastical history with papal favour and the help of God. The result would not appear before Gregory's death, yet the Pope had already played a decisive role in making it possible. At almost the same moment that Borronius was deepening his historical research, Rome witnessed an event that electrified scholars, clergy, and ordinary citizens alike. In the summer of 1578, labourers digging near the Via Salaria uncovered part of the buried world of early Christian Rome. This was no ordinary archaeological find. Beneath the earth lay a hidden landscape of passageways, tombs, chambers, inscriptions, and painted walls, preserved from centuries when the memory of such places had nearly vanished. The catacombs had once been known to pilgrims, but over time many had been forgotten, blocked, or filled with debris. Medieval devotion had preserved only fragments of this underground past. Renaissance humanists, despite their passion for classical antiquity, had shown little real interest in Christian cemeteries. They searched eagerly for pagan marbles and inscriptions, yet these burial places of the early church remained largely neglected. By the later 16th century, however, the climate had changed. The Catholic renewal had awakened new interest in the martyrs, in the primitive church, and in the visible traces of Christian antiquity. Philip Neri had already turned devotional attention toward the catacombs. Scholars engaged in controversy with Protestant writers were increasingly aware that the material remains of early Christianity could offer powerful support to Catholic claims. The moment was ready, and the discovery struck Rome with extraordinary force. Gregory XIII immediately grasped the importance of what had been found. At first, the site was thought to be connected with Saint Priscilla, and the Pope sent leading figures to inspect it carefully, including the Cardinal Vicar, the Jesuit superior, and the great scholar Marc-Antoine Muret. News spread quickly through the city. Crowds rushed to the place despite the summer heat. Barricades were broken down as Romans of every rank tried to see the newly opened cemetery. Cardinals, prelates, scholars, and common people mixed together in a shared atmosphere of excitement and reverence. What they encountered seemed to many like a buried Christian city. There were narrow corridors branching in every direction, multiple levels of tombs cut into the walls, chambers that looked like small chapels, fragments of sarcophagi, and inscriptions marked by a simplicity that moved visitors deeply. Frescoes appeared on the walls, showing images such as the Good Shepherd, Daniel among the lions, Moses striking the rock, the three children in the furnace, and figures identified as saints. To Catholic observers, these images seem to provide visible proof that the beliefs and devotional practices attacked by religious reformers had ancient roots. The underground cemeteries were no longer only tombs. They had become witnesses. Their silence appeared to speak in favour of the continuity of the Church. Not everyone reacted with reverence. Among the critics was an English observer tied to the interests of Elizabethan England, who mocked the enthusiasm of the Romans and sneered at what he saw as their eagerness to discover martyrs in every grave. Yet such hostility only highlights the importance of the discovery. Men understood immediately that these remains had apologetic force. For Baronius in particular, the catacombs were of immense value. He wrote about them with admiration and saw in them a concrete confirmation of ancient Christian testimony. What earlier generations had known only through texts could now be seen directly in the earth beneath Rome. The old descriptions of Christian burial, devotion, and communal life were no longer distant reports. The underground cemeteries gave them physical presence. Baronius himself could not devote all his energy to their detailed exploration since he was already absorbed in other major tasks. But others took up the work. Among the first were foreign scholars such as Alfonso Chacon and Philip de Winge, along with Jean Lheureux. They mapped passages, copied images, and extended their investigations beyond the first cemetery to other catacombs, including those of St. Priscilla. De Winge even prepared explanations of the paintings, though his early death was a heavy loss for a field of study that was only beginning to emerge. Soon afterward, Antonio Bosio would continue the work on a far larger scale and earn lasting fame as one of the pioneers of catacomb research. By then, the first cemetery had been closed again, probably to prevent disorder and misuse, though steps were taken to preserve inscriptions and relics. Even so, the discovery had already transformed Christian archaeology and deepened Catholic historical consciousness. The Pope's support for learning was not limited to scholars gathered at Rome. He also strengthened universities and schools, understanding that institutions were as important as individuals. Bologna, where he had once taught, held a special place in his memory. As Pope, he worked to improve its university by appointing distinguished teachers and by trying to draw students back, including Germans whose attendance had declined. He also supported the Gregorian College there, which became one of the signs of his lasting favour toward the city. Perugia likewise benefited from his attention. Elsewhere, his concern was guided not only by academic interest, but by confessional urgency. Universities such as Louvain, Besançon, and Würzburg mattered because they stood in regions where the defence of Catholic teaching required strong intellectual centres. Gregory understood that a university could serve as a fortress, no less than a classroom. In Rome itself, he expanded the Sapienza and increased the number of professors. Legal scholars, philosophers, Greek specialists, physicians, and men trained in other disciplines found opportunities there under his rule. One of the most celebrated names associated with the Roman university in this period was Marc-Antoine Muret, among the finest Latin stylists of the age. He had taught in Rome for years, moving through philosophy, civil law, and rhetoric, and his reputation became one of the glories of the institution. When foreign rulers tried to attract him elsewhere, Pope and city worked to keep him in Rome. Gregory later granted him an annual pension after he gave up his chair. Murray eventually turned with greater intensity towards sacred studies and charitable works, and when he died, his burial became an occasion for a striking display of respect from the scholarly world of Rome. Gregory's admiration for such men was part of a larger dream. He even imagined creating in Rome a kind of universal university, staffed by professors drawn from many Catholic nations, though his death prevented the full realization of that plan. The idea itself reveals the scale of his vision. Rome was not to be only the centre of authority. It was to become the intellectual crossroads of Catholic Europe. Printing was another field in which Gregory thought on a grand scale. He supported the publication of ecclesiastical works in Latin and encouraged the production of catechisms and other texts in Eastern languages. This was not a side interest. It was closely connected to missionary work, to pastoral reform, and to the need for doctrinal clarity across many regions of the Christian world. Notes from the period show how closely he followed these efforts. His ambition reached toward the creation of a great universal press, and he was willing to commit enormous sums to support it. A major step came when an Oriental press was established in Rome under powerful patronage and enriched with papal privileges. One of its earliest major productions was an Arabic version of the Gospels, printed in thousands of copies. Such undertakings show Gregory's mind moving far beyond Italy. He understood that language was power and that the printed page could carry Catholic teaching into lands and communities where ordinary Latin publishing had little reach. His concern for texts also extended into the liturgy. Plans were made in his reign for a new edition of the books used in liturgical chant. Leading musicians, including Palestrina, were commissioned to revise the chant books in light of the reforms of the Missal and Breviary. Yet Gregory drew a firm line when revision threatened to become innovation. The musicians produced something closer to a major rearrangement than a mere correction, and the Pope refused to endorse changes that seemed to alter the tradition too radically. This response was entirely consistent with his broader character. He favoured improvement, order, and accuracy, but he was deeply cautious toward novelty in sacred usage. His support for music and liturgical order did not mean a desire for experiment. On the contrary, his instinct was conservative. He wanted restoration, not revolution. At the same time, Gregory showed a keen appreciation for archives, manuscripts, and the preservation of records. He encouraged efforts to recover important papal documents from places such as Avignon and Anagni, and he tried to retrieve the correspondence of earlier popes. Earlier generations had already suffered painful archival losses, and memorials written during his reign complained of how much had vanished through neglect and disorder. Although not every proposal for reform could be carried out, a notable change did occur. Under Gregory XIII, the preservation of contemporary records became much more careful, especially in the Secretariat of State. In this respect, his pontificate marked an advance in administrative memory, as well as scholarly culture. He also enriched the Vatican library with books from his own collection and sought to strengthen it in other ways. Under the leadership of Cardinal Serletto, the library was administered with distinction. Learned men such as Fulvio Orsini worked there, and specialists laboured on the correction and restoration of ancient manuscripts. The library was known for being accessible. Printed books could be lent, scholars were allowed to consult manuscript catalogues, and visitors noted the richness of the collection. Rare codices, biblical manuscripts, theological works, and classical treasures stood side by side in its halls. The Vatican Library under Gregory was not a closed treasury, but a working centre of scholarship. The breadth of his intellectual patronage can also be measured by the flood of works dedicated to him. Theology formed the largest group, but other sciences were represented as well, along with books shaped by urgent events of the day, such as the struggle against the Ottoman Turks, the Jubilee, and the reform of the calendar. Poetry too found a place among the many offerings made in his honour. Some of these works remained unpublished, yet their number still testifies to the reputation Gregory enjoyed among scholars and writers. Authors from many countries and many walks of life sought his favour or expressed gratitude for support already received. Even prominent churchmen contribute important scholarly additions during his reign. Gregory encouraged new work on the Church Fathers, on biblical texts, on ritual books, and on major collections of canon law. He praised the great multilingual Bible produced under royal patronage in Spain and continued work on a revised Septuagint through commissions that included some of the most learned men of the time. His legal background gave special force to one of the great editorial enterprises of his pontificate, the revision of the canon law texts. Long before becoming pope, he had already taken part in efforts to improve the text of Gratian's decretals. Once he reached the papacy, he pushed the project forward with energy, seeking help from bishops and scholars in several countries. The aim was to establish a sounder and more reliable text for one of the central collections of canon law. Briefs were issued, privileges granted, and a new Roman edition eventually appeared. It was by no means perfect, since the state of scholarship still imposed real limits, but it represented an enormous labour and an important effort toward textual order. Gregory's interest in legal scholarship was not abstract. He understood that law, like history and liturgy, required good texts if the Church was to govern confidently and defend itself effectively. Another significant undertaking was the revision of the Roman martyrology. The task was entrusted to Sir Leto, who gathered a commission of notable scholars and used a wide range of sources, including ancient martyrologies, calendars, monologies, patristic texts, and manuscript evidence. The work advanced, but not without problems. Early printed versions contained so many mistakes that they had to be withdrawn. A corrected edition finally appeared with papal authority and was ordered into use. Even then, learned men such as Borromeo continued to refine and explain the material. Gregory wished to assist Borromeo financially, but Borromeo, bound by a vow of poverty, refused direct payment, and the Pope instead provided practical support in another form. This episode captures the spirit of Gregory's reign in miniature. He was willing to spend, to organise, and to protect whenever a serious scholarly task served the larger life of the Church. Taken together, these efforts reveal a pope whose patronage of learning was broad, deliberate, and deeply connected to the Catholic renewal of his age. Gregory XIII did not support scholarship as a mere luxury of court culture. He treated it as a living instrument of restoration. He strengthened universities, expanded libraries, encouraged presses, sponsored editors, employed historians, defended exegetes, fostered archaeology, and supported the careful preservation of documents. He helped create the conditions in which Catholic scholarship could answer its critics with sources rather than slogans, and with disciplined research rather than pious assertion alone. The age in which he ruled was one of conflict, controversy, and rapid change. Yet amid those pressures, Gregory XIII continued to act as a patron of books, teachers, archives, and ideas. In that role, he left behind something more lasting than ceremonial grandeur. He helped shape an intellectual revival that gave the late 16th century Church new confidence in its past, new tools for its defence, and a stronger voice in the learned world of Europe.